Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've never told this story to anyone except my family and a few close friends. But it's been almost 20 years now, and I still can't explain what I saw. I guess I'm hoping someone here might have had a similar experience, or could help me make sense of it. This happened back in 2004, when I was 8 years old. I grew up in a small town in rural Pennsylvania, one of those places where everybody knows everybody, and kids actually played outside instead of being glued to screens all day. My house was at the edge of town, with woods stretching out behind our property for miles. My parents both worked long hours, so I spent a lot of time at my grandma's house, which was right next door to ours. Me and my friends, Tommy, Jake, and Mitch, had built these awesome dirt jumps in a clearing about a quarter-mile into the woods behind my house. Nothing fancy, just piles of dirt we'd shaped into ramps with our shovels and watered down to pack them tight. We'd spend hours out there on our bikes, seeing who could get the most air. It was our favorite spot that summer. That day started like any other summer day. It was late July, hot and humid, the kind of day where your t-shirt sticks to your back within minutes of stepping outside. I remember eating lunch at my grandma's, peanut butter sandwich and apple slices, same as always, before grabbing my bike from the garage and heading over to Tommy's to see if he wanted to ride. Tommy was already outside with Jake and Mitch when I got there. We all rode to the jumps together, racing each other through the trails we'd worn into the forest floor over the past few summers. The dirt jumps were in this perfect little clearing that got just enough sunlight through the trees to keep the ground dry, but still had enough shade that we didn't roast while waiting our turns. We must have been out there for a couple hours, taking turns hitting the jumps and trying to one-up each other with tricks. I wasn't as good as the other. Guys, they were all a year older than me, but I was getting better. I'd finally worked up the courage to try the biggest jump we'd built. Around 4 in the afternoon, we noticed dark clouds rolling in from the west. Summer thunderstorms were common, and usually my mom or grandma would call me in before they hit, but I didn't have a watch and wasn't paying much attention to the time. My mom's gonna kill me if I get caught in the rain again, Tommy said, looking up at the sky. I'm heading home. Jake and Mitch agreed it was time to go, but I was still pumped up about finally conquering the big jump. I'm gonna stay a little longer, I told them. Just a few more runs. Whatever, Travis, Jake said. Don't blame us when your mom freaks out because you're soaked. They took off down the trail toward town, and I was left alone at the jumps. I didn't mind. Sometimes I actually preferred practicing without an audience. Less pressure. I pushed my bike back up to the starting point of our makeshift course at the top of a small hill that led down to the biggest jump. From up there, I had a pretty good view of the surrounding woods. The trees weren't super dense in that area, and I could see maybe 50 or 60 feet into the forest in most directions. The wind was picking up, making the trees sway and creating that eerie, rushing sound as it moved through the leaves. I was just about to start my run when something caught my eye at the edge of my peripheral vision. Something moving between the trees, maybe 50 feet away. At first, I thought it was Tommy or one of the other guys coming back, but this was different. It was tall, way taller than any of my friends, and it was moving weird, kind of slow and deliberate, like it was trying not to make noise. I froze at the top of the hill, straddling my bike, and just stared. What I saw still gives me chills when I think about it. It was white, not like paper white, but a dirty off-white or light gray color that stood out against the dark green of the forest. It was moving on 2 legs, but its arms, God, its arms were so long. They hung down almost to its waist, swinging slightly as it walked. The thing had almost no neck that I could see, just a head that seemed to sit right on its shoulders. And it was tall, There was a tree stand nearby that hunters used during deer season, with a platform about 6 feet off the ground. This thing's shoulders were right at the level of that platform, so whatever it was, it had to be at least 6 feet tall, probably more. I couldn't see its face clearly. It was moving through dappled shadows, and I was too scared to make any sudden movements that might draw its attention. But I could tell it was covered in hair or fur, not wearing clothes like a person would be. The weirdest thing was that it wasn't following any trail or path. It was just moving through the underbrush like it knew exactly where it was going. And it never looked in my direction, never seemed to notice me at all, even though I was sitting up on that hill in plain sight. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I wanted to run, to pedal as fast as I could back home, but I was terrified that any movement would make it see me. So I just sat there, completely still, watching as this thing made its way through the woods, moving from my right to my left until it disappeared into thicker vegetation. I waited what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or two before I finally worked up the courage to move. I didn't even try to hit the jump. I just turned my bike around and pedaled back toward the trail as quietly as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder. Once I hit the main trail, I stood up on my pedals and rode faster than I ever had before. The sky was getting darker, both from the approaching storm and because evening was coming on. Branches whipped at my arms and face, but I didn't slow down until I burst out of the woods and saw my grandma's house. I dropped my bike in the yard and ran inside, slamming the door behind me. My grandma was in the kitchen making dinner, and she looked up, startled. "Travis, what in the world? You look like you've seen a ghost." I was out of breath and probably white as a sheet. "Grandma," I gasped, "I saw something in the woods." "What do you mean, something?" She put down the wooden spoon she was holding and came over to me, checking me for injuries. It was big, taller than Dad, and white. It was walking on 2 legs through the woods by the jumps. My grandma's face changed then, not to fear or concern, but to that look adults get when they think a kid is making something up. "Oh, Travis, it was probably just a deer. They can look mighty strange when they're standing up on their hind legs reaching for leaves." "No, Grandma, it wasn't a deer. It had arms, long arms, and it was walking like a person." She sighed and patted my shoulder. "Your imagination is running wild again. Probably just a hunter in one of those ghillie suits they wear for camouflage." "In white? In the middle of summer?" I protested, but I could tell she wasn't buying it. "That's enough, Travis. Go wash up for dinner. Your mom will be home soon." I knew there was no point arguing with her. Adults never believe kids about this kind of stuff. But I knew what I saw wasn't a deer or a hunter. It was something else entirely. That night I barely slept. Every time the wind blew the branches against my window, I'd jerk awake, convinced that white thing had followed me home and was trying to get in. I kept the covers pulled up to my chin, even though it was way too hot for that. The next day, I rode back to the jumps with Tommy and the guys, half expecting to see footprints or some sign of the creature. But there was nothing. I didn't tell my friends what I'd seen. Even at 8 years old, I knew they'd just laugh and call me a scaredy cat. For weeks afterward, I refused to go to the jumps alone. I always made sure at least one other person was with me, and I'd constantly scan the woods, watching for any sign of movement, but I never saw it again. As time passed, the memory faded a bit, becoming hazier around the edges. I started to wonder if maybe my grandma was right. Maybe it had just been a deer standing weird, or some hunter in an unusual outfit. But deep down, I knew better. It wasn't until years later, when I was about 14, that I finally got some kind of confirmation. I was flipping through channels one night when I stumbled across this show about cryptids and paranormal encounters. They were doing a segment on Bigfoot sightings in Pennsylvania. I nearly fell off the couch when they started talking about reports of white Bigfoot creatures that had been spotted throughout the state. They showed a crude sketch that looked eerily similar to what I'd seen that day. The long arms, the absent neck, the height. According to the show, most Bigfoot are reported to be brown or black, but there have been dozens of documented sightings of white ones, particularly in the Appalachian region. The experts on the show suggested that the white ones might be juveniles or a different subspecies altogether. They said most reported white Bigfoot were smaller than the typical 8 to 10 feet tall specimens, usually around 6 to 7 feet. Exactly like what I'd seen. I ran to tell my mom, but of course she didn't believe me either. "You probably just remembered that story because you saw it on TV," she said. "Memory is funny like that. But I know what I saw, and now, all these years later, I still can't explain it. I've gone back to those woods many times as an adult, hoping to catch another glimpse or find some evidence, but there's never been anything. Sometimes I wonder if that thing knew I was there that day and chose to ignore me because I was just a kid, not a threat. Or maybe it was just passing through and never came back to the area. Either way, I know I'm not crazy, and I know I didn't imagine it. So that's my story. A white Bigfoot in the woods of Pennsylvania, seen by an 8-year-old kid who was just trying to ride his bike. I've never gotten any closure or explanation, and to this day, I still get a chill up my spine when I hear branches breaking in the woods. I've searched online for similar stories, and while there are plenty of Bigfoot sightings out there, I've never found anyone who had an experience quite like mine. So close, so clear, and at such a young age. If anyone else has seen something similar, especially in Pennsylvania, I'd love to hear about it. Sometimes I think I'm the only one who knows that these things are real, and they're out there, moving silently through the forests while we go about our lives, completely unaware. Story 2. I've been hunting most of my life. Started when I was 12 with my dad, and I'm 47 now. I've seen a lot of weird shit in the woods over the years. Strange lights, animals behaving oddly, even had a mountain lion stalk me once for about half a mile. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, compares to what happened to my buddy Mark and me 3 years ago in the Bitterroot Mountains. We'd been planning this grouse hunting trip for months. Mark and I have been hunting partners for over 15 years. He's the most level-headed guy I know, former military, works as an electrical engineer, doesn't drink much, doesn't do drugs, and isn't the type to make up stories. We're both experienced outdoorsmen. I've logged thousands of hours in the backcountry of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, and Mark even more so. That morning started like any other hunting trip. We drove out before dawn, my old Ford F-150 loaded with our gear, shotguns secured in their cases. We'd picked a remote area near some glacial lakes about 20 miles from the nearest town. The spot was known for good grouse hunting, but it required a decent hike in, which meant fewer people and more birds. By mid-afternoon, we'd bagged 4 grouse between us and were working our way through some thicker forest toward another clearing where we'd spotted birds earlier. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, partly cloudy, with just a light breeze. The kind of fall day that reminds you why you live in Montana, despite the brutal winters. We were maybe 5 miles from the truck, picking our way along a game trail that wound through a stand of old-growth pines. I remember checking my watch. It was around 4:30, and I was starting to think about heading back before dusk. That's when we heard it. At first, I thought it was a wolf. We have plenty of them in the Bitterroots, and while encountering one isn't common, it's not unheard of. But as the sound continued, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. This wasn't a wolf. It wasn't a coyote. It wasn't anything I'd ever heard before. The howl echoed through the trees with this deep, guttural quality that seemed to vibrate in my chest. But then it changed, rising to this sharp, almost screaming pitch that didn't sound natural. It didn't sound like it came from an animal, at least not any animal I knew, and I know all the predators in these mountains. Mark and I locked eyes. 20 years of friendship means you don't need words sometimes. We both dropped to a crouch simultaneously, instinctively making ourselves smaller. Neither of us spoke, The sound came again, closer this time, maybe half a mile away. "What the fuck is that?" Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. I shook my head. "No idea, but I don't like it." We both carried 12-gauge shotguns loaded with birdshot for grouse. Without discussing it, we both pulled slugs from our hunting vests and reloaded. A slug might stop a charging bear if you're lucky and your aim is perfect. But we weren't thinking about bears. I checked my phone. No service, as expected. The sun was noticeably lower now. The shadows, longer. We were still a good hour and a half from the truck if we moved at a normal pace, and the fading light meant we needed to get moving. Here's the problem. Whatever made that sound was between us and our vehicle. "We need to move," I said quietly. "Stay close. Stay alert." The terrain between us and the truck wasn't ideal. We'd have to cross a section of swampy ground with thick alder growth, the kind of place where visibility drops to about 10 feet. On a normal day, I'd be worried about surprising a moose or a bear in there. Today, I was worried about something else entirely. We moved as quietly as possible, which isn't very quiet when you're walking through ankle-deep water and dense brush. We'd gone maybe a quarter mile when I first noticed something was following us. At first, it was just the sensation of being watched, that primal feeling that's kept humans alive for thousands of years. Then came the sounds, branches breaking but not randomly, deliberate, paced. Something large was moving parallel to us, maybe 30 yards to our right, just keeping pace. "You hear that?" Mark whispered. I nodded, my mouth too dry to speak. Whatever it wasn't crashing through the brush like a panicked deer or a lumbering moose. It was moving with purpose, with intent. The way it navigated the thick underbrush was too quiet for its size, and it was big. You could tell from the weight of its footfalls when it occasionally stepped on a branch that snapped. The grouse we'd killed were in my pack. Without thinking, I took them out and dropped them on the trail behind us. Maybe as a distraction, maybe as an offering, I don't know. It just felt like the right thing to do. We continued side by side down the trail, our shoulders almost touching. Neither of us wanted to be the one walking behind. The thing kept pace, always just out of sight, always to our right, not directly approaching, not falling behind, just tracking us. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. My mouth tasted like copper. I've been afraid before, caught in a sudden lightning storm on an exposed ridge, nearly swept away crossing a river during spring runoff. But this was different. This was deeper, more primal. This wasn't fear of dying. This was fear of something I couldn't understand. The trail widened as we approached an old logging camp clearing. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the open space. We paused at the edge of the tree line, scanning the area before stepping out into the open. That's when it finally showed itself. It stepped out from the trees about 50 yards away, just for a moment, but long enough for us both to see it clearly silhouetted against the dusky sky. I'll never forget that moment, as long as I live. It was tall, at least 7 feet, maybe more. Broad-shouldered but proportioned like a human, not like a bear rearing up. Long arms that hung down past where its knees would be. Its entire body was covered in what looked like hair or fur, so dark it seemed to absorb the fading light around it. Its head sat directly on those massive shoulders with barely any neck visible. Mark gasped beside me. I couldn't even do that. I couldn't breathe at all. It just stood there, watching us. I could feel it looking at us, studying us, even though I couldn't make out its eyes in the fading light. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Instead, both Mark and I slowly sank to the ground, almost in unison. Not hiding. There was nowhere to hide, but making ourselves as non-threatening as possible. Neither of us raised our shotguns. The thought never even crossed my mind. It would have been like pointing a toy at a tank. I don't know how long we stayed like that. It felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The thing watched us, completely motionless, except for what might have been breathing. Then, without any warning, it turned and melted back into the forest. We lay there for what felt like forever, neither of us speaking or moving. My entire body was shaking so badly I could hear my teeth chattering. Finally, Mark whispered, "We need to move. Now." We got up and started walking, not running. Running feels like an invitation to chase, but moving steadily toward the next ridge. The creature followed us again, still keeping its distance, still to our right. I could hear it moving through the trees, matching our pace perfectly. This continued for nearly a mile until we crossed over a ridge onto a wider, more established trail, one that sees regular hikers and hunters. As soon as we hit that trail, the sounds of pursuit stopped. Just stopped. Like it had reached some invisible boundary it wouldn't cross. We didn't look back. We just kept walking, faster now, almost jogging the last 2 miles to the truck. Neither of us spoke. I fumbled with the keys, dropping them twice before managing to unlock the doors. We threw our gear in the back and got in, and I remember sitting there for a full minute, just staring at the steering wheel before I could make myself turn the key. The drive home was silent for the first hour. Finally, Mark said, "That wasn't a bear." "No," I agreed. "It wasn't." "What do you think?" "I don't know," I cut him off. "I really don't want to talk about it right now." We didn't speak about it again that night. In fact, we didn't discuss it for almost 6 months. Mark moved to Seattle for work shortly after, and I stayed in Missoula. But whenever we get together, which is only once or twice a year now, we eventually circle back to that day. We've researched, read books, looked at reports of similar sightings. We know what most people would say we saw, but labels don't matter. What matters is that something intelligent, something powerful, something that understood exactly what it was doing, followed us through those woods. I've never told this story to anyone except my wife, and even she doesn't know all the details. Not because I'm afraid people won't believe me, I don't care about that, but because I still can't make sense of it myself. Why did it follow us but not attack? Why did it show itself? Why did it stop at that trail? I still hunt, but never in that part of the Bitterroots, and never alone. Some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat. The image of that silhouette burned into my mind. Mark says the same happens to him. Whatever it was, it let us go. I think about that a lot. It let us go, and I can't shake the feeling that it was a decision, a choice made by something that could have easily done otherwise. Story 3. I still struggle to make sense of what I saw that day outside Kalispell. It's been 3 months, and I haven't told many people about it. Just my brother and my girlfriend, both of whom looked at me like I was having some kind of breakdown. Maybe writing it down will help me process it. I don't know. I was driving back from a weekend fishing trip near Hungry Horse Reservoir on September 17th. It was around 5 in the afternoon, and I decided to take Miller Creek Road as a shortcut back toward town. For those who don't know the area, it's this winding back road that cuts through some pretty dense forest before eventually connecting with Highway 2. There's barely any traffic out there, especially on weekdays. The weather was typical Montana fall, crisp, clear, maybe 55 degrees. I had my windows cracked a bit to enjoy the fresh air after being cooped up in my buddy's cabin all weekend. I was about 15 minutes into that stretch of road, just past where it narrows and the guardrails start because of the steep embankment on the right side. That's when I spotted what I initially thought was a dead bear on the shoulder of the road. Nothing too unusual around here. Bears get hit by cars more often than you'd think, especially in the fall when they're frantically feeding before hibernation. It was this dark brown mass maybe 30 yards ahead on the right side, partially on the gravel shoulder and partially in the tall grass. I slowed down from about 45 to maybe 20 miles per hour as I approached. I wasn't planning to stop completely. I mean, what could I do for a dead bear? But I was curious, and I wanted to see if it was something I should report to Fish and Wildlife. Maybe it was just recently hit and needed to be moved before it attracted scavengers. As I got closer, maybe 15 yards away, the dead bear suddenly moved. It wasn't just a twitch or a small movement. The entire mass shifted and then, in one fluid motion, it stood up. My first thought was, okay, it's an injured bear. But something felt wrong immediately. The way it stood was different. Bears can stand on their hind legs, sure, but this thing rose up in a single smooth motion and stood fully upright. It was tall, really tall. I'm 6 foot even, and this thing towered over me. If I had to guess, it was around 6.5, maybe 7 feet. It turned toward my car, and that's when I knew I wasn't looking at a bear. Its proportions were all wrong. It had this massive chest and shoulders, incredibly broad, but with a more tapered waist. And it was covered in this dark brown hair or fur. Not patchy like a mangy bear, but uniform all over its body. For maybe 2 seconds, it just looked in my direction. I couldn't make out its face clearly through my windshield at that distance and with the sun angle, but I could tell it was watching me. I had this overwhelming feeling of being observed, not just seen but studied. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. Then it moved. God, the way it moved. I've spent my whole life in Montana. I've seen bears, mountain lions, elk, pretty much every large animal in these parts. Nothing moves like this thing did. In a single motion, it turned away from my car and started, running parallel to the road, moving away from me. It was upright the whole time, not on all fours like a bear would be. Its gait was, I don't know how to describe it except to say it looked both powerful and weirdly graceful. Its arms swung at its sides, longer than they should be, loose and pendulum-like. I was still rolling forward slowly in my car, completely in shock. The thing reached the guardrail, a metal barrier about 3 feet high, and without breaking stride, it just cleared it with this effortless leap, not even a pause or stutter in its movement. Just this smooth, athletic jump that carried it over the rail and down the embankment on the other side. That's when I finally hit the brakes and came to a complete stop, right about where it had been lying. My heart was pounding so hard, I could feel it in my throat. I sat there for maybe 15 seconds, trying to process what I was seeing. The thing was already a good distance away by then, moving through the trees down the slope. It wasn't crashing through undergrowth like you'd expect from something so big. It was picking its way through the forest with this purposeful efficiency, still upright, still moving fast. I rolled down my passenger window to try to get a better look, but I wasn't about to get out of my car. No freaking way. As soon as the window went down, this smell hit me. This intense, foul odor like a skunk, but somehow worse. It had this musky, rotten undertone that made my eyes water. My first thought was that maybe there was a dead skunk nearby that I hadn't noticed, but the smell seemed to be coming from the direction the creature had gone. I watched until I couldn't see it anymore, which didn't take long with how fast it was moving and how dense the trees get as you go down that slope. The whole encounter, from when it stood up to when it disappeared from view, couldn't have lasted more than 20 seconds. But it felt like time had slowed down. I sat in my car for another minute or so, windows back up, trying to catch my breath and make sense of what I'd just seen. There was zero traffic. I was completely alone out there. Part of me wanted to back up and get the hell out of there as fast as possible. Another part was curious enough to consider following it, which in retrospect was insane. But mostly, I just sat there, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. My first thought was that it must have been a guy in a costume, but who would be out in the middle of nowhere in a bear costume, lying on the side of the road? And the way it moved, no one in a bulky costume could move that naturally or jump a guardrail that smoothly. Plus, the proportions were off for a human. The shoulders were too broad, the arms too long. I considered a bear with some kind of deformity or disease that made it walk upright, but again, the movement wasn't bear-like at all. Bears have this rolling gait when they're on 2 legs, kind of awkward and unstable. This thing moved like it was meant to be upright. Eventually, I put my car back in drive and continued on, partly because sitting there was making me more nervous by the second. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror and scanning the trees beside the road. That smell lingered in my car for miles, even after I closed the windows. When I got back to cell service, I spent hours that night searching online for answers. I looked up reports of unusual wildlife sightings in Montana, diseases that might cause bears to behave strangely, even, and I feel ridiculous typing this, Bigfoot sightings in the Flathead Valley area. I found some posts on local forums about similar sightings, mostly from hunters and hikers, but nothing that matched exactly what I saw. Most of the accounts I found were from further west, closer to the Idaho border. I considered reporting it to Fish and Wildlife, but what would I say? I saw something that looked like a man-bear, but wasn't either. I'd sound insane. The next day, I almost convinced myself. I'd seen a regular bear, and my mind had played tricks on me. Almost. But I kept coming back to how it moved, that fluid, bipedal gait, the way it cleared that guardrail without hesitation, the proportions of its body, the way it looked at me. A week later, I drove back out there in broad daylight. I'm not sure what I expected to find. Footprints, maybe, or broken vegetation where it went down the embankment. But there was nothing. Just the normal roadside gravel, some tall grass, and beyond the guardrail, a steep slope covered in pine trees and underbrush. I've been back to that stretch of road a few times since then, always during the day, always with a pit in my stomach. I never stop anymore. I just drive through as quickly as the curves allow, windows up, eyes forward. I've lived in Montana my whole life. I'm not someone who gets spooked easily in the woods or believes in monsters. I'm a practical person who works construction and goes hunting every season. But what I saw that day doesn't fit into my understanding of the world. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a man, and it moved with an intelligence and purpose that still gives me chills when I think about it. The strangest part is how it's affected me since. I used to go hiking alone all the time. I'd spend whole weekends backpacking in the Bob Marshall wilderness without giving it a second thought. Now, I can't shake this feeling of being watched whenever I'm in the woods. I've started bringing my dog everywhere, partly for company and partly as an early warning system. I've cancelled 2 hunting trips already this season because I can't bring myself to be out there at dawn or dusk. What bothers me most is not knowing what it was. If it was just a bear, I could move on. If it was some guy in a costume playing a sick prank, I'd be angry, but I could make sense of it. But my gut tells me it wasn't either of those things, and that uncertainty has lodged itself in my mind like a splinter I can't remove. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm not even sure I would believe this story if someone else told it to me, but I know what I saw that day on Miller Creek Road, and it's changed how I see these forests I've known all my life. Whatever it was at home out there in a way that made me feel like the intruder, and sometimes at night I still catch myself wondering if it's out there, watching other cars pass by, deciding whether to stay hidden or stand up again. Story 4. I still get chills typing this out, even though it's been 11 years. I'm 26 now, but sometimes I still wake up in cold sweats, thinking I can smell that awful stench again. This happened when I was 15, back in Somerset, Kentucky. I wasn't the outdoorsy type growing up, not like my dad Richard and my older brother Michael. They were always hunting, fishing, camping, you name it. Me? I preferred staying in town, playing video games, hanging with friends. Normal teenage stuff. Dad always tried to get me to join them, but I just wasn't interested. Until that spring when I finally caved. Dad had been begging me for months to join them on a hunting trip. "Tyler, you're becoming a man. It's time you learned these things," he kept saying. Michael, 3 years older than me, would roll his eyes whenever I made excuses. So I finally agreed to go squirrel hunting with them, mostly to shut them up. The day started out perfectly normal. Warm, sunny, birds chirping everywhere. We drove out to this spot about 30 minutes from town, somewhere near the Daniel Boone National Forest. I remember Dad parking the truck on this dirt road and handing me this old .22 rifle that had belonged to my grandfather. "You remember what I taught you at the range?" he asked, and I nodded, though truthfully I barely remembered anything. I'd only shot a gun maybe twice before. Dad's plan was for us to split up, cover more ground. "We'll take different hills," he said, pointing out the areas. "Michael, you take the East Ridge. Tyler, you go up that smaller hill to the north. I'll head west. Keep your walkie-talkies on." I remember feeling this twinge of anxiety as they walked away. The woods suddenly felt massive around me, but I acted tough, shouldered the rifle like I'd seen them do, and started walking up my assigned hill. For the first hour, nothing happened. I didn't see any squirrels, didn't shoot anything. Every few minutes I'd hear distant shots from either Dad or Michael's direction. At least they were having luck. I just wandered around, trying not to trip over fallen logs or get smacked in the face by branches. Then something changed. I can't explain exactly what happened first, but the forest just went wrong. The birds stopped singing, all of them, at once. It wasn't gradual. 1 second the woods were filled with chirps and calls, and the next there was nothing. Complete silence. I'd never experienced anything like it before. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the entire forest. I stopped walking, suddenly aware of my own breathing, which seemed impossibly loud. The silence was so heavy it felt physical, pressing against my ears. I checked my watch, just past noon. The sun was high, filtering through the leaves overhead, but somehow the woods seemed darker. I tried telling myself I was being stupid. The birds probably just got quiet because of the gunshots. That had to be it. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. Dad and Michael had been shooting for an hour, and the birds hadn't cared before. Something was different now. I decided to keep moving, but the silence was making me jumpy. Every twig that snapped under my feet sounded like a gunshot. I started sweating, even though it wasn't that hot. That's when I decided to head down into this small hollow nearby, thinking maybe I'd have better luck finding squirrels there. As I carefully made my way down the slope, that feeling of wrongness just kept growing. The hair on my arms was standing up despite the warm day. I kept the rifle ready, though I doubt I could have hit anything with how badly my hands were shaking. About halfway down the hollow, I heard it. Heavy footsteps, maybe 50 yards ahead of me. Relief washed over me. It had to be Dad or Michael. Maybe they'd changed locations and hadn't radioed me. I moved forward more quickly, eager to find them. The footsteps stopped, and I could see something through the trees, sitting on a large rock with its back to me. At first, my brain registered it as a bear. It was dark, large, and had what looked like fur. I immediately froze, remembering Dad's lectures about what to do if you encounter a bear, but something wasn't right about the shape. It didn't look quite bear-like. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The thing was just sitting there, perfectly still, on this boulder. Its back was broad, covered in what looked like dark, shaggy hair. Then it stood up. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing at first. This thing just kept rising. It unfolded upward and upward and upward. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. It was standing on 2 legs. Not a bear. Definitely not a bear. Its shoulders were impossibly wide, like a linebacker on steroids, but wrong. The proportions were all wrong. The head seemed to sit directly on those massive shoulders, with barely any neck visible. Long arms hung at its sides, ending in what looked like hands, not paws. I couldn't see its face. It never turned around. But somehow I knew it was aware of me. I could feel it, like it had known I was there the whole time, just waiting to see what I would do. I was completely paralyzed with fear. I couldn't run, couldn't scream, couldn't even breathe. The rifle in my hands might as well have been a toy for all the good it would do. Something instinctual told me that if I fired, I wouldn't get a second shot. Then I noticed movement to my left and to my right, faint rustling in the underbrush, careful and deliberate. There were more of them, moving in the trees around me, surrounding me. Before I could fully process this horrifying realization, the creature on the rock moved. It didn't turn, it just suddenly bolted forward with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone, crashing through the forest ahead of me. The moment it moved, the most ungodly smell hit me. It was like roadkill that had been baking in the sun for days, mixed with wet animal fur and something else I can't even describe, something chemical and wrong. The stench was so powerful, it made my eyes water and my stomach heave. The smell snapped me out of my paralysis. I turned and scrambled back up the hollow, slipping on loose rocks and grabbing at tree trunks to pull myself up faster. I didn't look back. I didn't look to the sides where I'd seen the other shapes moving. I just ran. When I reached the top of the ridge, I fumbled for my walkie-talkie with shaking hands. "Michael! Dad!" I choked out, my voice barely working. "Something's down here, something big," Michael answered first. "Tyler, what's wrong? You see a bear?" "No, not a bear. It's big. It's standing up. There's more than one." I couldn't even form coherent sentences. "Stay where you are," Michael said. "Dad and I are coming." I stood there, clutching the rifle to my chest, spinning in circles, terrified that those things were going to come bursting out of the trees at any second. Every shadow, every movement of leaves in the breeze looked like one of those creatures. Dad reached me first, about 15 minutes later, though it felt like hours. One look at my face and his expression changed from annoyed to concerned. "What happened?" he asked, gripping my shoulder. I tried to explain, but the words tumbled out in a jumble. Tall creature, hair, no neck, the smell, others in the woods. Dad's face grew more serious with each detail. When Michael arrived, Dad pulled him aside, and they had a whispered conversation I couldn't hear. Then Dad turned to me and said, "We're leaving. Now." We hiked back to the truck in silence, Dad in front, me in the middle, and Michael bringing up the rear, constantly checking behind us. No one spoke. The forest remained unnaturally quiet the entire time. In the truck, I expected Dad to tell me I was seeing things or had just spotted a bear standing on its hind legs. But he didn't. He just drove, knuckles white on the steering wheel, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror. It wasn't until we were almost home that Michael finally broke the silence. "Dad, was it one of those things you and Grandpa used to talk about?" Dad didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was tight. "We don't discuss this. Not with anyone. People around here, they don't take kindly to these stories. They'll think we're crazy or looking for attention." "But what was it?" I demanded. Dad looked at me in the rearview mirror. "Some things in these woods are better left alone, Tyler. Some things shouldn't be messed with. Your grandpa had a run-in back in the 70s. His daddy before him too. They're out there, have been for generations, but they usually keep to themselves." "But what are they?" I pressed. "I don't know," Dad said quietly. "Nobody does. But the old-timers around here, they have names for them." He wouldn't say more. When we got home, Dad told Mom we'd had a good day, got a few squirrels. A lie, we hadn't shot anything. And that was that. The hunting rifles were cleaned and put away, and no one mentioned what happened. But things changed after that day. Dad and Michael still went hunting, but they never asked me to come along again. Sometimes I'd catch them whispering, stopping when I entered the room, and I noticed Dad started carrying a much larger caliber rifle when he went into the woods. As for me, I haven't set a foot in those woods since. I moved away from Somerset for college and never moved back. Can't stand being that close to the forest. I've tried researching what I saw, looked up Bigfoot sightings, read about weird creatures in Kentucky folklore. But nothing quite matches what I experienced. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all. But then I remember that smell, that horrible, putrid stench, and I know it was real. Whatever was in those woods that day was real, and the worst part is knowing they're still out there, watching, waiting in the shadows where most people never think to look. I still can't explain what I saw that day, but I know one thing for certain. There are things in this world we aren't meant to understand, things that have existed alongside us for who knows how long, staying just out of sight. And sometimes, if you're unlucky enough, you catch a glimpse of them, and once you do, you can never unsee it. Story 5. I've never told this story to anyone outside my immediate family. It's been 6 years, and I still get chills thinking about those 2 nights in Morton. I don't expect anyone to believe me, but I need to get this off my chest. My family owned this small cabin deep in the woods near Morton, Washington for about 15 years. Nothing fancy, no electricity, no running water, just a simple getaway from city life. We'd visit every summer and fall when the weather was nice. The place had a screened-in porch where we'd sleep to catch the cool night air and listen to the forest sounds. I always loved that cabin. It was peaceful there, or at least it used to be. Looking back, there were always signs something wasn't right, but we ignored them. We'd hear occasional strange howls from the forest, not wolves or coyotes, something different. Sometimes we'd wake up to find our gear moved around outside, or strange scratches on the woodpile. I used to blame raccoons or maybe local kids messing with us. June 2017 changed everything. My wife Sarah and I decided to spend a long weekend there to open the cabin for the season. Our teenage kids were with friends, so it was just us. We arrived late Friday afternoon, cleaned up the place, aired it out, and got a fire going in the fire pit outside. Normal stuff. After dinner, we sat by the fire talking and enjoying some beers. It was getting dark, but the woods were alive with normal sounds. Birds settling down, insects chirping, the creek bubbling in the distance. Nothing unusual. Around 11, we put out the fire and moved to the screened porch with our sleeping bags. I remember waking up suddenly around 2 in the morning. The forest was weirdly quiet at first. Then I heard it, soft voices, almost like whispering, coming from the tree line about 30 yards from the cabin. I nudged Sarah awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. She nodded, her eyes wide in the darkness. It wasn't quite whispering though, more like, I don't know how to describe it, like children laughing very quietly, but distorted somehow. It moved around the perimeter of the clearing, never staying in one spot. "Maybe it's just the wind," Sarah said, but we both knew it wasn't. There was barely a breeze that night. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the woods, but saw nothing. Just darkness between the trees. The voices stopped as soon as I turned on the light. We sat in silence for maybe 5 minutes, holding hands like scared kids. I was about to suggest we try to go back to sleep when the first crack came. It was a tree limb snapping. Not like when a small branch falls. This was loud, like something heavy had broken it. Then another crack, from a different direction, and another. For the next hour, we sat frozen as branches and limbs snapped all around the cabin. Some sounded close, some farther away, but it was continuous. Crack, pop, snap, always moving, circling us. Whatever was doing it was large. Enough to break substantial branches. These weren't twigs being stepped on. "Should we call someone?" Sarah whispered. "No cell service out here, remember?" I replied. Our phones showed no bars, and the nearest neighbor was at least 2 miles away. Then, as suddenly as it started, the breaking stopped. Complete silence fell over the forest again. We didn't sleep the rest of the night, just sat there holding each other, waiting for dawn. When morning came, I went outside to look around. I found a few broken branches near the edge of the clearing, but nothing that would explain the sounds we'd heard. No footprints, no signs of animals, just some disturbed undergrowth and broken limbs. Sarah wanted to leave immediately, but I convinced her to stay. "It was probably just deer or elk moving through the woods," I said, not believing it myself. They can make a lot of noise at night. We spent the day hiking nearby trails, trying to convince ourselves everything was normal. We didn't venture too deep into the forest, though, and made sure to be back well before dark. That evening, we built another fire, bigger this time, and kept it burning longer. I brought our hatchet to the porch when we finally went to bed around midnight. I must have fallen asleep from exhaustion because the next thing I remember is Sarah shaking me awake. "Listen," she hissed. It was around 3 in the morning, according to my watch. At first I heard nothing, then detected movement from the direction of the creek, about 75 yards from the cabin. Something was moving through the water, splashing lightly. We waited, barely breathing. The splashing stopped, then the silence was shattered by a howl that made my skin crawl. It was high-pitched but powerful, starting low, then rising to a pitch that hurt my ears. Not an animal sound I've ever heard before or since. Not a wolf, not a cougar, not anything natural. Before the echo died away, something charged through the trees toward our cabin. I can't describe the terror of that moment. Whatever it was big and fast, snapping branches and crashing through undergrowth as it moved. The sound came straight at us, and I was certain it would burst through the cabin wall or the screen any second. I stood up, hatchet in hand, positioning myself between the sound and Sarah. Not that it would have helped. Whatever was coming through those woods sounded powerful enough to tear the cabin apart. About 20 yards from us, it suddenly veered off, crashing away through the forest in a different direction. The sounds gradually faded, but we could hear branches breaking for what seemed like minutes afterward. We didn't speak. We packed our essential belongings in the dark, got in our car, and drove away as soon as there was enough light to see the road. We left most of our camping gear behind. When we returned a week later with my brother-in-law, I refused to go alone, we found more evidence of whatever had been there. Several large broken branches were scattered at the edge of the woods. One tree, about 8 inches thick, was snapped about 4 feet up from its base. Not cut, not gnawed, snapped clean through with splintered wood, showing incredible force. There were no clear tracks in the soft forest floor, just moss and leaves pressed down in wide swaths, creating paths through the underbrush. My brother-in-law suggested a bear, but bears don't break trees that size, and they don't howl like that. Besides, I've encountered bears before. They don't terrify me the way whatever this was did. We put the cabin up for sale the following month. Never went back except to sign the papers when it finally sold a year later. The new owners seemed nice, a young couple looking for a weekend retreat. I almost warned them, but what would I say? By the way, something inhuman lives in these woods and likes to circle the cabin at night. They wouldn't have believed me. I still think about those 2 nights sometimes. About what might have happened if whatever was in those woods hadn't turned away at the last moment. About what made that howl that still haunts my dreams. The worst part is not knowing. Bears leave tracks, cougars leave tracks, people leave tracks. Whatever was in those woods that night left nothing but broken trees and fear. I've researched local legends since then. The Pacific Northwest has its share of stories: Sasquatch, Wendigo, dark spirits from Native American lore. Nothing quite matches what we experienced. All I know is something powerful and intelligent didn't want us there, and it made sure we knew it. Sometimes I think about the new owners. I wonder if they've heard the voices in the woods, or the branches breaking in the night. I wonder if they've faced whatever charged our cabin that night. Part of me hopes they haven't encountered anything, that maybe it was just a one-time thing, something passing through. But another part knows better. I don't go camping anymore. Sarah and I moved to the city, where the only night sounds are traffic and neighbors. Sometimes when the wind blows hard and branches scrape against our apartment windows, I freeze, listening for that distinctive pattern of movement, that deliberate circling, waiting for that howl that doesn't belong to any known animal. I don't know what was in those woods near Morton. I don't want to know. But whatever it was, it's still there, and sometimes on windy nights I swear I can still hear branches breaking. Story 6. I'm still not sure if I should be sharing this, but honestly, I need to get it off my chest. What happened to my husband Stephen and me last summer has completely changed how I feel about the outdoors. We used to be avid campers. We'd spend weeks at a time in the wilderness during summer break. I'm a high school science teacher, and Stephen works remotely as a software developer. This gives us the flexibility to take extended trips. This particular trip started like any other. We'd been camping along the Clearwater River for about a week, enjoying the solitude and beautiful weather. Our campsite was pretty secluded, about 2 miles from the nearest occupied site and accessible by a narrow dirt road. We'd set up our big 8-man dome tent. We liked the extra space, even though it's just the 2 of us, along with our usual camping setup. That day, it was a Thursday, I think, we decided to drive into Lewiston for dinner. Nothing fancy, just craving a hot meal we didn't have to cook ourselves. We spent maybe 3 hours in town, had dinner at this little family restaurant, did some grocery shopping, and headed back to our campsite around 8 in the evening. It was still light out, but the sun was starting to set. As we pulled up to our campsite, I immediately knew something was wrong. Our tent was completely knocked over, like someone had deliberately pushed the whole thing down. All our stuff, sleeping bags, clothes, books, everything, was scattered across the ground. "What the hell?" Stephen said, parking the truck. We both got out and started looking around, trying to figure out what happened. At first, we thought maybe it was vandals or some kids messing around, but nothing seemed to be stolen. Our cooler was untouched, and even my tablet was still there on the picnic table where I'd left it. The whole thing was bizarre. We started picking everything up, trying to salvage what we could before it got dark. I remember feeling unsettled, like we were being watched, but I brushed it off as paranoia. Stephen was more concerned about getting the tent back up before nightfall. After about 20 minutes of cleaning up, I took some pillows to put in our truck. We were debating whether to sleep in the truck that night instead of the tent. That's when it happened. I was walking back to the truck when I noticed movement in my peripheral vision, maybe 15 feet away near the tree, line that separated our campsite from the river. My first thought was that it was a deer. We'd seen plenty of them during our stay. But when I turned to look, my blood ran cold. Whatever it was, it stood up and kept standing up and up. This wasn't a deer. It wasn't a bear. It was massive, tall and broad-shouldered. In the fading light, I could make out a silhouette that was disturbingly human-like, but much, much larger. It was covered in what looked like brownish fur, or maybe it was just the skin color, I couldn't tell for sure, in the dimming light. I froze completely. I couldn't speak, couldn't scream, couldn't even breathe. The thing took a few steps toward the river's edge, moving with this strange, fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large. I only saw it for a few seconds before my brain kicked back into gear. "Stephen," I managed to whisper shout, not taking my eyes off the figure. Stephen was busy trying to untangle our tent poles and didn't look up immediately. "What?" "Look," I pointed, but by then the figure had moved behind some trees along the riverbank. "There's something over there, something big." Stephen finally looked up and scanned the area, but couldn't see what I was pointing at. "What did you see?" "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking, "but it was huge, like unnaturally huge, and it was standing on 2 legs. Stephen must have heard the fear in my voice because he immediately dropped what he was doing and came over to me. "Are you sure it wasn't a bear?" "Bears don't stand that tall," I said. "And it didn't move like a bear. It moved like a person, but bigger." We stood there for a minute, both of us staring into the trees. Then we heard it, branches breaking, underbrush rustling. Something large was moving through the woods. "Get in the truck," Stephen said quietly. "Now." We didn't need to discuss it further. We both ran to the truck, jumped in, and locked the doors. Stephen started the engine, and we sat there for a moment, debating what to do. "Should we leave?" I asked. "I think we should," Stephen replied, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "We can come back tomorrow in daylight." The drive away from our campsite was tense. I kept looking back, half expecting to see something following us. We drove straight to Redding, about 30 miles away, and checked into the first motel we found. Neither of us slept well that night. I kept replaying what I'd seen in my mind, trying to make sense of it. The next morning, we decided to go back. In the light of day, with a good night's sleep, or at least a few hours in a locked motel room, the whole thing seemed less terrifying. Stephen suggested we bring a camera to document anything we might find. I think he was trying to reassure me that there would be a logical explanation. We arrived back at our campsite around 10 in the morning. Everything was exactly as we'd left it. Tent still collapsed, our belongings still scattered. It was strange that no animals had disturbed anything overnight. "Show me where you saw it," Stephen said, camera in hand. I walked to the spot where I'd been standing and pointed to the tree line. It was right there, and then it moved that way, toward the river. Stephen walked over to the area I indicated. "About how tall was it?" I tried to remember. "Tall, really tall. Its shoulders were maybe here." I held my hand up to indicate the height. Stephen looked at where I was pointing, then at a nearby tree. He walked over to the tree and held his hand up to the same height I'd indicated. "Clara, that's like over 7 feet tall." A chill ran through me. "I know what I saw." Stephen didn't argue. Instead, he started taking pictures of the area where I'd seen the figure, of our demolished campsite, of the ground around us. "Let's look around," he suggested. "Maybe we can find some tracks or something." We spent the next hour combing the area. At first, we didn't find anything unusual, just our own footprints and some small animal tracks. Then Stephen called me over to a spot about a quarter mile from our campsite, where a narrow game trail led up a small hillside. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the ground. At first, I didn't see what he was indicating. Then I noticed the indentation in the soft earth, a large foot-shaped print, much bigger than either of our boots. Once I saw the first one, I started seeing more. There were maybe 20 distinct prints, showing a path moving uphill, then descending, then crossing the road. What struck me most was how deep they were, about an inch into the ground. Stephen, who weighs about 150 pounds, stepped in the same spot and barely left a mark. "Whatever made these is heavy," he said, a hint of awe in his voice. We followed the tracks as best we could. They varied in position and depth, as if whatever made them had been navigating the terrain carefully. Some prints showed toes digging in where the creature had climbed uphill. Others showed a different weight distribution, like it had been moving cautiously, aware of its surroundings. The most unsettling part was the pattern. The tracks led from the hillside, down to near our campsite, then back up the hill again. Whatever it was had been watching us. It had deliberately come down to investigate our campsite while we were gone, then retreated when we returned. As we followed the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched again. The forest around us seemed too quiet, like even the birds and squirrels knew something wasn't right. "Stephen," I said quietly, "I think we should go." He nodded, taking a few more pictures of the prints. "Yeah, I think so too." We hurried back to our campsite, threw our belongings into the truck, and left the collapsed tent behind. Neither of us wanted to spend any more time there than necessary. On the drive back to Redding, we discussed what I'd seen and what we'd found. Stephen, ever the rational one, tried to come up with explanations. Maybe it was a bear walking on its hind legs. Maybe it was someone in a costume playing a prank. Maybe the tracks were from multiple animals that just happened to follow the same path. but I know what I saw. The proportions were all wrong for a bear, too tall, too narrow at the waist, shoulders too broad. And those tracks, they were unmistakably foot-shaped, with 5 toes, just like a human's but much larger. We ended our camping trip early and drove home the next day. We reported what we'd found to the local ranger station, but I could tell from their reactions that they didn't take us seriously. They probably get reports like ours all the time from over-imaginative campers. It's been almost a year now, and we haven't been camping since. Stephen still looks at the pictures sometimes, trying to make sense of what we found. The footprint photos are clear. Whatever made them was real. But they don't capture the feeling of standing there in the fading light, seeing something that shouldn't exist rise up to its full height and move with deliberate, intelligent purpose. I don't know what we encountered that day. I don't have a name for it, though I'm sure others would be quick to label it. All I know is that something was there, something that knew we were there too, something that was curious enough to investigate us, but wary enough to keep its distance. Sometimes I still wake up at night, thinking about those few seconds when I saw it stand up. I wonder if it's still out there, moving silently through the forest, watching. And I wonder if it remembers us as clearly as we remember it. Story 7. I'm still trying to make sense of what happened to me last summer. I've always been the rational type, not one to jump to wild conclusions, but this experience has left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the woods of northern Minnesota. My buddy, Jake, and I had been planning this camping trip for months. We both needed to get away from our jobs and the constant notifications on our phones. Lake Janette, north of Orr, Minnesota, seemed perfect, remote enough to feel like we were actually disconnecting, but not so far into the wilderness that we'd be completely screwed if something went wrong. We arrived at the campsite around 2 in the afternoon. The weather was perfect. Not too hot, just a light breeze, and the mosquitoes weren't as bad as they usually are in Minnesota during summer. We set up our tent about 50 yards back from the lake, surrounded by these massive pine trees. The forest floor was covered with pine needles, dead leaves, and those little twigs that snap when you step on them. The afternoon went by quickly. We fished for a few hours. Jake caught 3 walleye. I got skunked as usual, cooked them over the fire, and cracked open some beers. Nothing unusual happened that evening. We swapped the same old stories we always tell when we're camping, watched the stars come out, and finally turned in around 11. I fell asleep almost immediately. I was exhausted from driving and setting up camp. The next thing I knew, I was wide awake in pitch darkness. I didn't know what had woken me up. At first, I thought it might have been Jake snoring, but he was sleeping quietly for once. I checked my watch. The little button that lights up the display showed it was just after 4 in the morning. That weird time when it's still completely dark, but technically morning. I lay there for a minute, trying to figure out what had jolted me awake. The forest was completely silent. No wind, no animal sounds, nothing. It was that unnatural kind of quiet that makes the hair on your arms stand up. And then I heard it. At first, it was faint. Just the sound of something moving through the underbrush, maybe 30 or 40 yards away from our tent. I've been camping my whole life, so I'm familiar with the sounds of deer or raccoons moving around at night. This wasn't that. The footsteps were too deliberate, too heavy. Each step made this dull thud that I could feel more than hear, like a slight vibration coming up through the ground. The rhythm was all wrong for a 4-legged animal. It was definitely walking on 2 legs, but the steps were spaced further apart than a normal person's would be. I held my breath and listened as the footsteps got closer. Whatever it was heading straight for our tent. There was no mistaking it now. Each footstep was crushing leaves and snapping those little branches on the forest floor. But these weren't the crisp snaps you'd hear from a person walking. These were deeper, more substantial breaks, like someone was putting serious weight on each step. By this point, my heart was pounding so hard I was surprised it didn't wake Jake up. The footsteps were getting closer, maybe 20 yards away now. I tried to convince myself it was just another camper, maybe someone who'd had too much to drink and was stumbling around. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. The steps were too regular, too purposeful for a drunk person. I reached over and was about to wake Jake when the footsteps suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the footsteps. At least with the footsteps, I knew where the thing was. Now, I had no idea if it was still there, watching our tent, or if it had moved somewhere else. After what felt like forever, but was probably only 15 seconds, I couldn't take it anymore. I called out, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Hello? Who's there?" My voice sounded pathetically small in the vast darkness of the forest. For a moment, there was no response. Just that same heavy silence. Then something hit the side of our tent with such force that the whole thing shook. It wasn't a branch or a pine cone, it was heavy and solid. A rock, a big one. It hit the tent wall about a foot from where my head was and then tumbled down the side. Jake woke up instantly. "What the fuck was that?" he hissed. Before I could answer, we heard the footsteps again, but now they were moving away from the tent. They weren't running, just walking steadily, heavily, back into the forest. The whole thing, from when I woke up to when the footsteps faded away, couldn't have been more than a couple of minutes. But it felt like hours. "There's something out there," I whispered to Jake. "Something big." We sat in silence, straining to hear any sound of the thing returning. Neither of us was brave enough to unzip the tent and look outside. Eventually, Jake fell back asleep, but I stayed awake, listening to every creak and rustle in the forest until the first gray light of dawn filtered through the tent fabric. As soon as it was light enough to see, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The morning was cool and damp, with a light mist hanging over the lake. Everything looked completely normal. Birds were singing, squirrels were chattering in the trees. It was hard to believe that just a couple of hours earlier, something had been stalking around our campsite. I walked to where I thought the rock had landed and found it almost immediately. It wasn't just a pebble. This was a chunk of granite about the size of a softball. It would have taken some strength to throw it hard enough to make the tent shake like that. Then I walked in the direction where I'd heard the footsteps. The ground was covered with pine needles and fallen leaves, but I could see places where they'd been disturbed. I tried to recreate the sound I'd heard. I'm not a small guy, about 6 feet tall and around 200 pounds, but no matter how hard I stomped, I couldn't make the ground vibrate the way it had when that thing was walking. I followed what I thought was its path for about 50 yards before losing the trail. Whatever had been there hadn't left any clear footprints, just disturbed areas in the forest litter. I looked for broken branches at eye level, thinking maybe it was a bear walking on its hind legs, but there was nothing. When I got back to the campsite, Jake was up and making coffee on our little camp stove. "So what do you think that was last night?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but I could tell he was rattled. "I don't know," I admitted. "But it wasn't a person, and it wasn't any animal I'm familiar with." We didn't talk much as we packed up our gear. Neither of us said it out loud, but we were both ready to get the hell out of there. The beautiful, peaceful forest that had welcomed us yesterday now felt menacing, like we were being watched from between the trees. As we were loading the last of our stuff into the car, an older guy from a nearby campsite walked over. He was probably in his 60s, with a grey beard and the weathered look of someone who'd spent a lot of time outdoors. "You boys heading out early?" he asked. We explained that we'd had a weird experience during the night. As I described the footsteps and the rock thrown at our tent, the man's expression changed from friendly curiosity to something more guarded. "You know," he said slowly, "I've been coming up to these woods for almost 40 years. There are things in these forests that don't make the wildlife brochures." He wouldn't elaborate beyond that cryptic statement, just wished us safe travels and walked back to his campsite. His words made the skin on the back of my neck prickle. The drive home was quiet. Jake and I tried to come up with rational explanations for what had happened. Maybe it was some local kids playing a prank. Maybe it was a bear, and we just misinterpreted the sounds. But neither of us believed these explanations. Not really. I've spent hours researching since then, looking for similar experiences in the Ore area or around Lake Janette. There are a few vague stories, nothing concrete, but enough to make me think we weren't the first people to experience something strange in those woods. I've always considered myself a skeptic when it comes to Bigfoot stories or other cryptid sightings. I'm still not saying that's what we encountered that night, but I know what I heard, and I know what I felt. That impossible heaviness in each footstep, the deliberate way it approached our tent, and the calculated response when I called out. It wasn't random. It wasn't an animal acting on instinct. Whatever was in those woods that night knew exactly what it was doing. It wanted us to know it was there, and it wanted us to be afraid. And it succeeded. I haven't been camping since then. Jake says he has, but I notice he only goes to established campgrounds now, with lots of other people around. Sometimes when I'm falling asleep at night, I'll hear that sound again in my head, that heavy, deliberate footstep, and I'll find myself holding my breath, listening for what comes next. I don't know what was in those woods that night, but I know I never want to meet it again. Story 8. I've hiked these Pennsylvania mountains for over 12 years now. I know the trails, the seasons, the wildlife patterns, all of it. At least I thought I did. What happened last Thursday has completely shattered that confidence, and I still can't sleep properly 4 days later. I set out early, around 7 in the morning. The weather was perfect, about 55 degrees, slight breeze, clear skies. I packed light, just water, some protein bars, my camera, a small first aid kit, and my sidearm. A Glock 19 I've carried on solo hikes ever since a bad encounter with an aggressive black bear 3 years ago. The forecast showed the temperature would hit the mid-70s by afternoon, so I wore my moisture-wicking pants, a long-sleeve thermal that I could roll up, and my trusted hiking boots that have seen hundreds of miles. The trail I chose isn't marked on most maps. It's one of those local secrets, steep, challenging, but with the most incredible summit views of the valley. I've done it at least 20 times before. I usually finish the ascent in about 4 hours, spend an hour at the summit, and then head back down before dusk. Everything was completely normal for the first 3 hours. I passed a couple who were turning back about a quarter of the way up, but otherwise had the trail to myself, typical for a Thursday in October when most people are at work. I stopped at my usual resting spot at the 3-hour mark, drank some water, and checked my phone. No service, as expected. I took a few photos of a hawk circling overhead and continued upward. That's when things started to feel different. I was maybe 40 minutes from the summit when a weird sensation crept over me. It wasn't dramatic, just this subtle feeling of being observed. At first, I dismissed it. When you hike alone a lot, your mind plays tricks on you. I figured it was probably just a deer watching me from the tree line, or maybe a fox. I kept moving, but the feeling intensified. 10 minutes later, I stopped dead in my tracks. The hairs on my arms were standing up, despite the warmth of the day. I took out my earbuds. I almost always listen to podcasts while hiking, and just listened. Silence at first, then a sound I still can't properly describe. It was like something moving through the underbrush, but more deliberate. Start, stop, start, stop. And the weirdest part, it was coming from uphill, from in front of me, not behind. I stood completely still, controlling my breathing the way I learned in a wilderness survival course years ago. Animals generally don't approach humans directly. They circle, they observe, they retreat. Whatever this was, it wasn't following typical wildlife behavior. I decided to continue, but I left my earbuds out. I also unsnapped the holster of my sidearm, not drawing it, just making it accessible. The summit was close, maybe 15 minutes away, and I figured I'd be more exposed, but would have better visibility up there. The summit area of this mountain isn't a clean peak. It's a series of massive boulders scattered across the top, almost like they were dropped there by giants. Between them are these small spaces, almost cave-like in places, where the rocks meet at odd angles. In winter, they fill with snow. In summer, small animals sometimes use them as dens. I reached the boulder field and navigated to my favorite spot, a flat rock that juts out slightly, offering a panoramic view of the valley below. The uneasy feeling had subsided somewhat, so I took out my camera and started taking photos. The valley was stunning that day, with the fall colors just beginning to show in patches of red and gold among the green. I don't know what made me turn around. Some primal instinct, I guess. But when I did, I saw it. Or rather, I saw something move. It was so fast I almost doubted my own eyes. Just a flash of black fur sliding behind one of the larger boulders about 20 feet to my left. My brain immediately catalogued it as too big for a raccoon, too fast for a bear, wrong shape for a deer. It moved with a fluid quickness that made my stomach drop. I froze completely. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I stared at the spot where I'd seen the movement, trying to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. The logical part of my brain was desperately searching for an explanation, maybe a fisher cat or a large marten. But it was too big for either of those. For 30 seconds, maybe longer, I didn't move a muscle. I just kept replaying what I'd seen. The black fur, the deliberate movement, the way it seemed to know exactly where to hide. Then a horrifying realization hit me. Whatever it was had managed to approach within 20 feet of me without making a sound I could detect. Despite my heightened awareness, despite my years of wilderness experience, despite being in an area with minimal ground cover, and if it could do that, my sidearm probably wouldn't help much, not against something that could move that fast and was clearly hunting me with intelligence. Because that's what was happening. I was being hunted. The thought broke my paralysis. I didn't run. Running triggers predatory instincts, but I moved quickly. I jumped across several boulders to reach the main trail and began my descent. The sun was already lower than I'd like, maybe 3 hours from setting. I needed to cover ground fast. I kept my pace steady but quick, constantly scanning my surroundings. Every few minutes I'd stop, turn in a complete circle, and listen. Sometimes I'd take photos in different directions, not for the scenery, but so I could zoom in later and check for anything I might have missed. About 30 minutes into my descent, I heard it again, that same deliberate movement sound, but now from the tree line to my right. Start, stop, start, stop, like it was timing its movements with my own. I called out, "I know you're there!" My voice sounded thin and frightened even to my own ears. No response, just that same eerie silence that follows a sudden noise in the woods. I picked up my pace, moving faster than was probably safe on the rocky trail. I stumbled twice, scraping my hand on the second fall. The small cut stung, but I barely noticed it. I was too focused on getting down the mountain before darkness fell completely. The entire way down, I felt eyes on me. Not once did that sensation fade. It was like being under a microscope, being studied, assessed. I've been in the woods my entire life, encountered bears, coyotes, even a mountain lion once far out west. But I've never felt like this, like I was being toyed with by something that was enjoying my fear. When I was about a mile from the trailhead, my phone suddenly beeped with an incoming text. Service had returned. I nearly cried with relief. I called my brother, who lives nearby, and asked him to meet me at the parking lot. I didn't explain why, just that it was important. He must have heard something in my voice because he didn't ask questions. The last stretch of trail was the longest of my life. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle in the underbrush made me flinch. I had my hand on my sidearm the entire time, though I never drew it. When I finally broke through to the parking area, my brother was already there, leaning against his truck with a confused expression. He took one look at my face, and his expression changed to concern. "What happened?" he asked as I threw my backpack in his truck. I couldn't even begin to explain. Not then. I just said, "Let's go. I'll tell you later." As we pulled away, I looked back at the trailhead. The trees were dark silhouettes against the dimming sky. And for just a second, though my brother says it was just my imagination when I later told him, I swear I saw something black move from behind one tree to another at the edge of the parking lot. I've gone through my photos a dozen times since then. There's nothing clear, nothing I could point to and say, "There, that's what I saw." But in 3 of the photos I took looking back up the trail during my descent, there's a dark blur just at the edge of the frame. It could be nothing, a shadow, a fault in my camera. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. I've been hiking those mountains for 12 years without fear. Now I don't know if I'll ever go back. Whatever was on that mountain wasn't a normal animal. It was too deliberate, too intelligent in its stalking. And the way it moved, that fluid, lightning-fast movement, still gives me chills when I think about it. If there's one thing I've learned from this experience, it's to trust your instincts in the wild. When something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't rationalize it away. Don't push through because you've done this trail 100 times before. Nature doesn't care about your experience or your confidence. For the first time in my life, I truly understood what it means to be prey, and I never want to feel that way again. Story 9. I've never been the type to believe in monsters or the supernatural. I was always that person who'd roll my eyes when friends talked about ghost sightings or strange creatures in the woods. But what happened last month has completely changed my perspective, and I still get chills thinking about it. I live in a small house on the edge of the Ouachita National Forest in Arkansas with my 13-year-old daughter, Emma. We've been here for about 4 years, and until recently, I've always loved the peaceful isolation. That night started like any other. It was a Tuesday in early October, and I'd been working late on some paperwork for my job. Emma had stayed up with me, curled up on the couch reading while I finished up. I hadn't realized how late it had gotten until I checked my phone and saw it was already 2:30 in the morning. "Emma, honey, we need to get to bed," I said, stretching my stiff back. She looked up from her book and yawned. "Mom, I forgot my backpack in the car. I need it for school tomorrow." I sighed, knowing we'd have to walk out to our detached garage about 40 yards from the house. Our property sits on a small hill that slopes down toward the forest edge, with the garage positioned near the bottom of our yard. Any other night, I might have told her to just get it in the morning, but she had a test first period and needed her notes to study before school. "All right, let's go get it real quick," I said, sliding my feet into my slippers. It was a clear night with a 3/4 moon that cast everything in a silvery glow. The air was crisp but not too cold, typical for October in these parts. Emma and I didn't even bother with jackets. The grass was wet with dew, and I remember feeling it seep through my thin slippers as we made our way down the gentle slope toward the garage. We were about halfway to the garage when Emma suddenly grabbed my arm. Her grip was so tight it actually hurt. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Look, over there." I followed her gaze toward the tree line, maybe 70 yards away from where we stood. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just the dark silhouettes of trees against the night sky. But then I saw it, and everything inside me went cold. Standing halfway down the hill near the edge of the forest was something. It was tall, impossibly tall, and completely white. In the moonlight, it almost seemed to glow. My first thought was that someone was playing a prank, that maybe a neighbor had wandered onto our property in some kind of costume, but deep down, I knew that wasn't right. This thing was too big, too still, too wrong. It was shaped like a human, but it stood at least 8 or 9 feet tall. It had arms and legs and a head, but the proportions were off. Its arms hung down almost to its knees, and its torso was massive, not fat, but broad and powerful looking. The whole thing was covered in what looked like thick white fur or hair that moved slightly in the breeze, and it was staring right at us. I couldn't make out facial features from that distance, but I could feel its eyes locked on us. I've never felt so exposed, so hunted. "Mom," Emma whispered again, her voice barely audible. "What is that?" Before I could answer, before I could even process what I was seeing, the thing moved. And God, how it moved. It wasn't like watching a person run or even an animal sprint. It moved with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. In one fluid motion, it darted in a wide half circle, covering at least 30 yards in seconds. Then it suddenly stopped and crouched down low near one of the larger trees at the forest edge. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Emma was pressed against me, shaking uncontrollably. I had one arm wrapped around her shoulders, pulling her close, while my other hand was clenched in a fist so tight my nails were digging into my palm. "Is it hiding?" Emma whispered. That's exactly what it looked like. The creature was hunched forward, its massive white form partially concealed by the tree. But it wasn't really hidden. The white stood out starkly against the dark forest. It was as if it thought it was hiding, like a child who covers their eyes and thinks you can't see them. Against every instinct for self-preservation, I took a few steps forward, squinting to get a better look. Emma clutched at my sleeve. "Mom, don't," she hissed. I stopped, my senses finally catching up with my curiosity. What the hell was I doing? Whatever this thing was, it wasn't something I wanted to get closer to, but I couldn't look away either. The creature remained crouched, bent slightly forward, not moving except for what looked like slow, deliberate breathing. Its posture was so unnatural, so deliberate, like it was consciously trying to blend in but didn't quite understand how. For a moment, we all just stayed frozen, Emma and I standing in the middle of our yard, and this massive white creature crouched at the edge of the forest. Then a branch snapped somewhere in the woods behind it, and the thing's head snapped toward the sound with startling speed. That break in its attention was all I needed. I grabbed Emma's hand and whispered, "Run, to the garage, now." We didn't sprint. Somehow I knew that sudden movement might trigger something worse. Instead, we walked quickly, my grip on Emma's hand so tight I was probably hurting her, though she never complained. I could feel the weight of the creature's gaze return to us as we moved, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. My entire body was screaming at me to get my daughter to safety. The garage door had never seemed so far away. When we finally reached it, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the lock. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to unlock it and push Emma inside, following right behind her and slamming the door shut. I locked it immediately, then leaned against it, my breath coming in gasping sobs. Emma was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "Mum, what was that? Was that a person?" "No," I said, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. "No, that wasn't a person." We huddled in the garage for almost 20 minutes, too afraid to leave. Emma retrieved her backpack from the car, and we both sat on the cold concrete floor, our backs against the door. I had my phone with me, and I debated calling the police, but what would I even say? That we saw a giant white furry humanoid in our yard. They'd think I was drunk or crazy. Eventually, I peered through the small window in the garage door. The yard was empty. There was no sign of the white figure. "I think it's gone," I told Emma, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice small. I wasn't sure at all, but we couldn't stay in the garage all night. "We're going to make a run for it, okay? Straight to the house as fast as we can." Emma nodded, clutching her backpack to her chest like a shield. I took a deep breath, unlocked the door, and we bolted. I've never run so fast in my life. We sprinted across the yard, up the slope to the house, and didn't stop until we were inside with the door locked behind us. Once inside, we closed all the blinds and checked every lock twice. Emma was trembling so badly that her teeth were chattering. I made her some hot chocolate, and we sat at the kitchen table trying to make sense of what we'd seen. "Maybe it was a bear?" Emma suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. "Bears don't stand on two legs like that," I said. "Not for that long. And it wasn't a bear. Bears don't move like that." "A person in a costume?" I shook my head. "No costume could make someone that tall, and nobody could move that fast." We went through every possible explanation: an escaped zoo animal, a lost hiker with a white parka, even a hallucination we both somehow shared. None of it fit what we'd seen. We ended up sleeping in my bed that night, with all the lights on. Neither of us slept much. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside made us jump. When dawn finally broke, I felt a small measure of relief, though the fear hadn't subsided. I called in sick to work, and Emma stayed home from school. Around 10 in the morning, I called my friend Diane, who lives a few miles away. Diane's husband is an avid hunter who knows these woods better than anyone. I didn't tell her everything over the phone, just that we'd seen something strange in the yard, and it had scared us. Diane came over around noon, bringing her husband's rifle with her, something I was immensely grateful for, though I didn't say so. I gave her a watered-down version of what happened, saying we'd seen what looked like a very large animal or person near the tree line. I was too embarrassed to describe exactly what we'd seen, afraid she'd think we were making it up. "Let's go take a look," she said after I finished. I was reluctant to go back out there, but having Diane with me and knowing Emma was safely inside the house gave me enough courage to agree. We walked down to where the creature had been standing the night before. The ground was soft from recent rain, and there were plenty of tracks, mostly deer and raccoon from what Diane could tell. "There's nothing unusual here," she said, scanning the area. "No signs of anything big enough to scare you like that." I felt a mixture of relief and frustration. "It was right here," I insisted. "It was huge, Diane. 8 feet tall at least." She gave me a skeptical look, but kept searching. We spent almost an hour combing the area, but found nothing out of the ordinary. No strange footprints, no broken branches, no tufts of white fur caught on trees. Nothing to validate what Emma and I had seen. "Maybe it was just shadows," Diane suggested gently as we walked back to the house. "The moonlight can play tricks on your eyes." I nodded, but I knew better. What we'd seen wasn't a trick of the light or a figment of our imagination. It was real, solid, and deliberate in its movements, and that's what terrifies me the most, the intelligence behind those movements. The way it watched us, the way it tried to hide, the way it seemed to understand that we were watching it too. It's been 4 weeks since that night, and we haven't seen the creature again. I've installed motion sensor lights all around the property and security cameras on every corner of the house. Emma refuses to go outside after dark, and honestly, so do I. We don't talk about what we saw much, but I know it's always on her mind, just like it's on mine. I've done some research since then, looking into local folklore and reported sightings of strange creatures in the Ouachita region. There are stories, vague accounts of tall, white figures seen in the forests at night. Most people dismiss them as tall tales or misidentifications of known animals. But I know what we saw. Every night when I lock the doors and check the windows, I find myself looking out toward that spot at the edge of the forest. Sometimes I think I see movement there, a flash of white among the trees. It's probably just my imagination, my mind playing tricks on me because of that night. At least, that's what I tell myself. But sometimes, when the house is quiet and Emma is asleep, I swear I can feel it watching us still. That massive white figure, crouched just beyond the reach of our lights, waiting for what I don't know, and I hope I never find out. Story 10. I still can't sleep right, when I think about what happened to me and my dad back in the summer of 2008. I've never been the type to believe in monsters or anything, but what we experienced in those woods near Syllamore Creek changed everything for me. I've kept quiet about it for years because I didn't want people thinking I was crazy, but I need to get this off my chest. My dad and I used to spend a lot of time hunting for ginseng and golden seal in the forests around Arkansas. It was something we'd done since I was a teenager. Good money if you know where to look. And my dad knew those woods like the back of his hand. He'd grown up roaming those forests, hunting, fishing, and foraging. Nothing ever seemed to scare him out there. That summer day was hot and muggy, typical Arkansas weather. We'd driven out early, parked the truck at an old logging road, and hiked about 4 miles into some pretty remote territory. The area around Syllamore Creek is dense forest. We're talking thick undergrowth, steep hills, deep hollows, and not many people. Perfect for ginseng hunting because it's undisturbed. We'd been digging roots for about 3 hours, working our way down a small ravine. I remember wiping sweat from my forehead when everything suddenly went quiet. And I mean dead quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. In the woods, that's never a good sign. Dad noticed it too. He straightened up from where he was digging and gave me a look. Then we heard it. The sound started as a low rumble, almost like distant thunder, but it grew into this guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the trees. I've heard bears, cougars, and all kinds of wildlife, but this was different. It was deeper, more powerful, and had this intelligence to it. Like it wasn't just an animal noise, but something trying to communicate. My dad's face went pale. That's what scared me the most. In 30 years of hunting and hiking, I'd never seen him look afraid of anything in those woods. But right then, he was terrified. He whispered, "We need to leave. Now." No explanation, just an urgent command as he quickly packed up his tools. I followed his lead, shoving my gear into my backpack with shaking hands. As we started moving away, the growl came again, louder this time and definitely closer. It sounded like it was coming from the ridge above us. We picked up our pace, not quite running but moving as fast as we could through the dense underbrush. The forest floor was covered with fallen branches and rocks, making it impossible to move quietly. Every snap of a twig under our boots seemed to echo. About half a mile from where we'd heard the first growl, it came again. This time it was so close I swear I could feel the vibration in my chest. Whatever was making that sound was following us, and it was getting closer. Dad stopped suddenly and pulled out his revolver, a .357 Magnum he always carried for protection against wild boars or the occasional aggressive black bear. His hand was shaking slightly as he checked the chamber. I'd never seen him do that before. "If something comes at us, get behind me," he said in a low voice. We continued moving, faster now, no longer caring about the noise we were making. The 4-mile hike back to the truck seemed endless. Every shadow between the trees, every rustle in the undergrowth made my heart race. The weird thing was, we never actually saw anything, just that terrible growl that seemed to follow us all the way to the edge of the forest. When we finally reached the truck, Dad threw our gear in the back and we got out of there fast. Neither of us spoke much on the drive home. What could we say? We'd both been scared by a sound we couldn't explain. That night, I asked Dad what he thought it was. "I don't know," he said, staring into his coffee cup. "And I don't want to know." For almost a year after that, neither of us went back to that specific area. But my dad was stubborn. The following summer, in 2009, he decided to try a different spot about 2 miles from our encounter. I couldn't go with him that day because of work. When he came home, hours earlier than expected, I knew something was wrong. He was visibly shaken, his usual confident demeanor completely gone. "What happened?" I asked as he sat heavily at the kitchen table. He described how he'd been working his way along a dry creek bottom when he found a footprint. Not just any footprint, a bare, human-like print that was way too big to belong to any person. He said it was at least 16 inches long and incredibly deep in the hard-packed soil, suggesting whatever made it was extremely heavy. "No one lives out there, Jason," he said. "It's miles of nothing but woods and hills." My dad took a small notepad from his pocket and showed me a rough sketch he'd made of the print. It had 5 toes, just like a human foot, but the proportions were all wrong. The toes were longer, spread wider, and the ball of the foot was massive. "I felt like something was watching me the whole time," he added, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I got out of there as fast as I could." After that second incident, we both agreed to stay away from those particular woods. We still occasionally walked the railroad tracks that bordered the forest when we needed to reach other hunting spots, but even that felt wrong. Whenever we'd walk those tracks, the woods would fall completely silent. That unnatural quiet would settle around us, and we'd both get this overwhelming feeling of being watched from the tree line. It wasn't just us either. Local coon hunters started sharing similar stories. These guys had dogs bred for bravery, trained to tree bears and face down wild boars. But something in those woods was scaring these dogs so badly they'd turn tail and run, whimpering and refusing to go back, no matter how their owners urged them on. The hunters described hearing strange howls that didn't match any known animal in the region. A few months after Dad found that footprint, my brother had his own experience. He was driving down one of the country roads near Syllamore Creek late at night with 2 female friends. As they passed a cornfield, their headlights caught what looked like glowing reddish eyes at the edge of the field. My brother, being curious, slowed down. As they got closer, something massive stood up from where it had been crouching. He described it as being covered in thick, reddish-brown fur with a distinctive grayish V-shape across its chest. It was huge, standing on 2 legs like a man, but much, much bigger. The thing just stared at them for a moment, then turned and disappeared into the darkness with surprising speed for something so large. One of the girls in the car started crying hysterically and wouldn't stop all the way back to town. My brother tried to convince himself it was just a bear standing on its hind legs, but he knew bears don't stand that tall or move that way. For a while, these experiences became the topic of hushed conversations in our family, but we didn't share them widely. People around here don't take kindly to what they see as tall tales or crazy talk. Then, about 3 years later, my mother had her own encounter. She was driving to work early one morning, just as the sun was coming up. The road she takes runs parallel to those same railroad tracks for a few miles. In the dim morning light, she saw what she initially thought was a person walking along the tracks. As she got closer, she realized whatever it was stood around 8 feet tall and was covered in dark hair. It walked with a heavy, distinctive stride, arms swinging at its sides. She said there was no way it was human. The proportions were all wrong, and the way it moved was just different. Mum considered turning around to get a better look, but couldn't work up the courage. When she told us about it that evening, her hands were still shaking. My mother is the most practical, no-nonsense person I know. If she says she saw something, she saw something. These experiences have convinced me that there's something out there in those woods around Syllamore Creek. The area is perfect for something to remain hidden. Thousands of acres of thick forests, endless hollows and ravines, caves, and very few people. You could wander those woods for decades and never see another human being in some of the more remote sections. I've spent hours researching, trying to find explanations for what we all experienced. I've looked into known wildlife, local legends, even the possibility of escaped exotic animals. Nothing fits. The only conclusion I can come to is that there's something living in those woods that science hasn't classified yet. I'm not saying it's Bigfoot. I'm just saying we encountered something that doesn't fit into our understanding of what exists in those forests. Whatever it is, it's intelligent enough to remain hidden, powerful enough to scare experienced outdoorsmen, and real enough that multiple members of my family have encountered it independently. I haven't been back to those specific woods since that day in 2008. Sometimes I dream about that growl, that deep, rumbling sound that seemed to come from something ancient and powerful. I wake up sweating, with the certain feeling that whatever made that sound is still out there, roaming those hills and hollows, watching and waiting. Every time I drive past Syllamore Creek now, I can't help looking into those dark woods and wondering, is it watching me right now? Does it remember the humans who entered its territory years ago? I'll probably never know the answers, but one thing I know for certain, there's something out there in those Arkansas woods that doesn't want to be found, and maybe it's better that way. Story 11. I still get goosebumps thinking about that night in October '82. I was 17, and I've never told many people about what happened because, well, who the hell would believe me? But I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here has seen something similar. It was a Friday night, and I was driving back from my friend Lisa's house in Cornell. This was in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, for those who aren't familiar. I had my dad's old Chevy Impala that night instead of my usual rust bucket because mine was in the shop getting the brakes fixed. It was around 10:30 at night, pitch black the way it gets up there in the woods, no streetlights or anything. Just my headlights cutting through the darkness on County Road 426. I remember every detail like it was yesterday, not 40 years ago. The radio was playing Eye of the Tiger. It was super popular that year, and I was singing along, tapping the steering wheel. It had rained earlier, and the road was still damp, making it shine under my headlights. There wasn't another car in sight, just trees on both sides, dark and thick, and that ribbon of asphalt stretching ahead. I was going about 50, which was pretty normal for that road, even though the speed limit was 45. I wasn't in any hurry to get home, just enjoying the drive and the music. The heater was blowing because October nights get cold in the UP, and I remember the smell of wet leaves coming through the vents. As I approached this slight leftward bend in the road, anyone who knows that stretch between Cornell and Watson knows the one I'm talking about. My headlights swept across something standing at the edge of the road. At first, I thought it was a hitchhiker, which was weird enough at that hour in the middle of nowhere. It was just standing there, maybe 60 yards ahead, right at the spot where the pavement meets the gravel shoulder. I slowed down to about 30, thinking maybe it was someone who had car trouble. Up there, you help people out, you know. There aren't cell phones or anything back then. If someone's stranded, you stop. But something felt off right away. The figure wasn't moving at all, not even shifting weight from one foot to the other like a normal person would. It was just standing there, completely still, watching my car approach. The closer I got, the more my stomach knotted up. Something was very wrong with the proportions. This thing was tall, way too tall, and its arms, God, its arms hung down past its knees. They were just hanging there, these impossibly long limbs ending in hands that looked too big for even its massive frame. My brain was scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe it's a guy in a costume, I thought. Maybe it's a practical joke. But who would be out here, in the middle of nowhere, playing pranks? And why would they just stand there, not moving? By the time I was about 30 yards away, I realized I was looking at something between 8 and 9 feet tall. It had this massive build, not fat, but just big, powerful, like an ape man or something from one of those Bigfoot documentaries, but worse somehow. It was covered in this smooth black hair all over its body. The only part that wasn't completely covered was its face, which had this dark gray color to it, almost like slate. Its face is what still haunts me. It wasn't exactly human, but it wasn't entirely animal either. The features were almost prehistoric, is the only word I can think of. Like what you'd imagine early humans looked like, but mixed with something ape-like. The proportions were all wrong. The jaw too heavy, the brow too pronounced. I had slowed down to barely 20 miles per hour at this point, partly out of fear and partly because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I didn't want to get any closer, but I also couldn't just stop in the middle of the road. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. When I was about 15 feet away, close enough that my headlights were fully illuminating this thing, our eyes met. I'll never forget that moment for as long as I live. Its eyes reflected my headlights with this blood-red glow, like a deer's eyes, but much, much worse. There was intelligence in those eyes, awareness and fear. Yes, fear. That's what was so strange about it. This massive, terrifying creature looked as scared of me as I was of it. Its expression was almost startled, like it hadn't expected a car to come along, or maybe it wasn't used to being seen. The whole encounter probably lasted 7 seconds at most, but it felt like time had slowed down. I was close enough now that I could see its chest moving as it breathed. I could see the texture of the hair on its body, how it moved slightly in the breeze. Then, in a movement so fast it was almost a blur, the thing turned away from the road. It moved with this unreal speed. Nothing that big should be able to move that quickly. It took one leap, just one, that had to be at least 10 feet, and it was gone into the swamp beside the road, just vanished into the darkness. The cattails and marsh grass barely moved. There was no sound of splashing or crashing through underbrush. It was just gone. I floored it. The tires spun on the wet pavement before catching, and the Impala shot forward. I didn't slow down until I hit the outskirts of Watson, probably doing 70 or more the whole way. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and I was hyperventilating. When I got home, my parents asked why I looked so pale. I told them I'd nearly hit a deer, which wasn't uncommon up there. I couldn't tell them what I'd really seen. They would have thought I was making it up, or that I'd been drinking or something. That night, I barely slept. I kept seeing those red eyes whenever I closed mine. I kept thinking about how unnaturally fast it had moved, how impossible its proportions were. No human looks like that. No known animal looks like that either. The next day, I drove back that way in broad daylight, telling myself I had imagined it or exaggerated it in my mind. But when I reached that bend in the road, I stopped the car and got out. There, right where it had been standing, the gravel on the shoulder was disturbed, and at the edge of the swamp, several cattails were bent and broken in a way that suggested something large had passed through. I've spent years trying to make sense of what I saw that night. I've looked into Bigfoot sightings and Native American legends about forest spirits. I've read about prehistoric hominids and wondered if somehow, in the vast wilderness of the Upper Peninsula, something could have survived that shouldn't exist anymore. Some people I've told have suggested it was a bear standing on its hind legs, but I know what bears look like. This wasn't a bear. The proportions were all wrong, the movement too deliberate. Bears don't have those kinds of arms, that kind of face, and bears don't look at you with intelligence and fear the way this thing did. Others have suggested I was tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but I know what I saw. It was real, solid, there in the headlights of my dad's Chevy Impala on County Road 426. I'm 40 years older now, and I've never seen anything like it again. I've driven that road countless times since then, always with a knot in my stomach, always scanning the edges of the pavement. But whatever it was, it's never reappeared. At least not to me. I still live in the UP, though not in the same town. Sometimes when I'm driving at night and pass a particularly dense stretch of forest, I find myself slowing down, my eyes drawn to the darkness between the trees. I wonder if it's still out there, whatever it was. I wonder if it remembers our brief encounter the same way I do. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, sometimes I barely believe it myself. But I know what I saw that night in October '82. Something that shouldn't exist. Something that blurs the line between human and animal. Something that has no name in our scientific textbooks. And all I can think is that if I saw it once, other people must have seen it, too. So I'm putting this out there, hoping maybe someone will read this and think, that sounds like what I saw too. Because the alternative, that I'm the only one who's ever seen this thing, is somehow even more terrifying than the memory of those glowing red eyes watching me from the darkness at the edge of County Road 426. Story 12. I've debated posting this for years. I mean, who would believe me? I'm just a regular postal worker who happened to look out his window at the wrong time. Or maybe the right time, depending on how you see it. But I can't keep it inside anymore. What I saw that day in October 2001 changed me forever. It was a Tuesday. I remember because I'd had a particularly rough day at work. Some new sorting machine was malfunctioning, and we were backed up for hours. By the time I got home to my apartment on Oak Ridge Drive, I was exhausted. My place wasn't anything special, a one-bedroom on the third floor of an older building, but it had this big window in the living room that overlooked Pinecrest Park. That view was honestly why I rented the place. After being stuck inside the post office all day, coming home to see trees and open space was worth the slightly higher rent. I'd just kicked off my shoes and grabbed a beer from the fridge when I noticed the sky had that perfect golden-orange glow of late afternoon in fall. It was around 5 o'clock, and there was still plenty of daylight. I remember thinking how quiet the park seemed. Usually there would be a few dog walkers or joggers making their way around the paths, but that evening it was strangely empty. I was standing there, just staring mindlessly out the window, when movement at the far edge of the clearing caught my eye. At first I thought it was a bear, which would have been unusual enough. We occasionally got black bears in the area, but they rarely ventured that close to the apartments. But as I focused, I realized whatever I was looking at was walking upright, and it was huge. I froze with my beer halfway to my lips. This thing, this figure, was striding across the open field toward a dense patch of bushes and trees on the other side. It moved with purpose, with a natural but odd gait that I can still see perfectly in my mind. Its arms swung slightly at its sides, longer than a human's should be, and it was covered, head to toe, in thick brown hair. But the most shocking thing was its size. I'm not exaggerating when I say this thing stood at least 8 feet tall, maybe even taller. I've delivered mail to enough houses to have a good sense of height and scale. This creature was massive, broad-shouldered and solid, not gangly or thin. There was a power to its movement that I could sense even from my window. The whole sighting couldn't have lasted more than 15 or 20 seconds before it disappeared into the thick vegetation at the park's edge. But in those seconds, my entire worldview shifted. I stood there, completely still, beer dripping from the bottle I'd unconsciously tilted, making a puddle on my carpet that I didn't even notice until later. My first rational thought was that it had to be someone in a costume, but that made no sense. The proportions were all wrong for a person, even a very tall one. The movement was too fluid, too natural. And who would wear such an elaborate costume just to walk across an empty park into the woods? It wasn't Halloween yet. There were no film crews around. It just didn't add up. I remember setting down my beer and rubbing my eyes hard, then looking again. But whoever I'd seen was gone. The park was empty again, peaceful in the fading daylight, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. My hands were shaking. I felt cold all over, despite my apartment being warm. I went back to the window and pressed my face against it, scanning the tree line where the figure had disappeared. Nothing moved except the branches swaying slightly in the breeze. I grabbed my phone, thinking I should call someone, but who? The police. "Hello, officer. I'd like to report a Bigfoot sighting from my apartment window." Yeah, right. They'd think I was drunk or crazy. My friends wouldn't believe me either. Hell, I wasn't sure I believed myself. I spent the rest of that evening pacing around my apartment, repeatedly going back to the window to stare at the spot where I'd seen the creature. I couldn't eat. I couldn't focus on TV. I kept replaying those 15 seconds in my mind, looking for some explanation that made sense. Around midnight, I finally worked up the courage to grab a flashlight and walk down to the park. I know, not the smartest move, but I had to see if there was any evidence. Footprints, broken branches, anything. The park was deserted and eerily quiet. The only sounds were distant traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves. I made my way to the approximate spot where I'd seen the figure cross, sweeping my flashlight beam across the ground. The grass showed nothing. It was too dry and hard to hold footprints. I moved toward the thicket where the creature had disappeared and hesitated at the edge. The beam of my flashlight seemed pathetically inadequate against the dense darkness between the trees. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. What if it was still in there? What if it saw my light? I took a few steps into the underbrush, branches scratching at my arms. The smell of damp earth and vegetation was strong. About 10 feet in, I stopped dead. There was another smell, musky, animal-like, but not like any animal I'd encountered before. And then I heard it, a deep, rumbling sound that might have been a growl, or might have just been my imagination working overtime. I got out of there fast, practically running back to my apartment building. I locked the door behind me and even pushed my couch against it, feeling ridiculous, even as I did it. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. I just couldn't face sorting mail and making small talk like everything was normal. Instead, I spent hours online, searching for information about Bigfoot sightings in our area. There weren't many, just a few vague reports from hikers in the mountains about 20 miles away. Nothing close to town, nothing as clear and unmistakable as what I'd seen. Over the following weeks, I became obsessed. I bought books on cryptozoology, joined online forums, and spent every evening by my window with a camera ready, hoping for another glimpse. I never saw it again, but sometimes, especially at dusk, I'd get this feeling of being watched. I'd look out at the tree line and swear I could make out a shape slightly darker than the surrounding foliage, perfectly still, observing me as I observed the forest. I started taking different routes home from work, driving slowly past the park, scanning the edges where forest met open space. I even bought a higher quality camera with a zoom lens, but I never managed to capture anything conclusive. The worst part was not having anyone to talk to about it. I tried once telling a co-worker over lunch. He laughed and asked if I'd been drinking. After that, I kept it to myself. I was afraid of becoming that crazy Bigfoot guy at work. I already had enough trouble fitting in, but the experience changed me in ways I couldn't have anticipated. Before that day, I was just going through the motions. Work, home, TV, sleep, repeat. Afterward, I felt awake for the first time in years. The world suddenly seemed bigger, more mysterious. If this creature could exist practically in my backyard without anyone knowing, what else might be out there that we're missing? 6 months after the sighting, I joined a local hiking group, not because I particularly enjoyed hiking, but because it gave me legitimate reasons to be in the woods, looking around. I volunteered for trail maintenance in Pinecrest Park and the surrounding wilderness areas. I learned to identify animal tracks and signs. I became more observant, more in tune with the natural world around me. One evening, about a year after my sighting, I was clearing a trail in an area about a mile from my apartment when I found something that stopped me in my tracks. It was a clump of hair caught on a broken branch, about 7 feet off the ground. The hair was coarse and brown, too high up to be from a deer or bear, too coarse to be human. I carefully collected it in a plastic bag. I still have it, stored in a small box along with detailed notes about where and when I found it. The truth is, even after all these years, I've never been able to fully explain what I saw that day. I've gone through every possible explanation: bear standing upright, man in a costume, hallucination, and none of them fit what I witnessed. The creature moved too naturally to be someone in a suit. It was too large and walked too comfortably on 2 legs to be a bear. And I wasn't tired enough, stressed enough, or imaginative enough to hallucinate something so detailed and specific. I still live in the same apartment. Sometimes new neighbors or delivery people comment on the beautiful view of the park, and I just nod and smile. How do you tell someone that you're not staying for the view, but because you're waiting for another glimpse of something that shouldn't exist? I've never seen it again as clearly as I did that first time. But sometimes, especially in fall, when the light gets that same golden quality, I'll catch movement at the corner of my vision. By the time I focus, it's gone, if it was ever there at all. But I keep watching, I keep my camera ready. And I've learned to pay attention to the silences in the park, when the birds suddenly stop singing, when the squirrels disappear, when the air gets heavy with a kind of expectant hush. I don't expect most people to believe me. I probably wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, but I know what I saw. And I know that somewhere out there, moving silently between worlds, our civilized one and the wild unknown, is a creature that defies explanation. A creature that, for one brief moment on an ordinary October evening, allowed itself to be seen by a tired postal worker who just happened to be looking out his window at exactly the right time. I haven't told many people this story, but sometimes I wonder how many others have seen something similar and, like me, kept it to themselves out of fear of ridicule. How many unexplainable moments are out there, collected in the minds of ordinary people who simply didn't know who to tell or how to explain what they witnessed? All I know is that the world is stranger than we imagine. And sometimes that strangeness walks right across your field of vision in broad daylight, daring you to believe your own eyes. Story 13. I still get goosebumps thinking about that morning. It's been 7 years since it happened, but I remember every detail like it was yesterday. I'm not the type of guy who believes in crazy stuff or makes up stories. I'm pretty much your average Joe. Work in construction, pay my taxes, watch hockey on weekends. Nothing special. But what I saw that day on Highway 4, it changed something in me. It was April 12th, 2016. I remember the date because it was my nephew's birthday, and I was planning to call him after work. I was heading to a job site in Tofino, driving my work truck, a Ford F-150 that had seen better days, but still got me where I needed to go. The weather was classic Vancouver Island stuff. Dark, misty, and that persistent rain that isn't quite a downpour, but soaks you through if you're out in it for more than a minute. My windshield wipers were squeaking slightly as they swept back and forth, and I had the heater cranked up to keep the windows from fogging. I'd made that drive 100 times before. Highway 4 cuts through some of the most dense, untouched wilderness you can imagine. Massive trees pressing in on both sides of the road, making you feel tiny as you wind through the mountains. That morning, traffic was light, just me and the occasional logging truck passing in the other direction. It was around 9:30 in the morning when I approached this particular corner. Anyone familiar with that stretch knows there's a small bridge where the road crosses over a creek. It's a bit of a blind turn, so I always slow down there. The rain had picked up slightly, and I was focused on the road, hands gripping the wheel a little tighter than usual. As I started making the turn, something caught my eye about 100 feet ahead. At first, my brain didn't process what I was seeing. There was this figure running down the center of the road. Not jogging, not even sprinting like a human athlete. This thing was moving in a way I've never seen before. Fast, unnaturally fast. My foot instinctively moved to the brake, and I felt the truck slow. I blinked hard, thinking maybe the rain was playing tricks on my eyes. But it wasn't. This was real. The figure was massive and dark, like a silhouette, but with substance and volume. As I watched, it made this incredible leap from the center of the road. One moment it was there, and the next it was... It's hard to describe. It was like it covered an impossible distance in a single bound. It landed on the right side of the road on the bank and then turned toward the tree line. That's when I got my first clear look at it. Holy shit! Even now, typing this out, my hands are getting clammy. This thing was huge. Not just tall, but massive in every dimension. I'd put it at about 8 feet tall, maybe more. Its shoulders were insanely wide, like 4 feet across easily. No human has proportions like that, not even close. Its body was covered in hair, not fur like a bear, but hair. A strange mix of reddish and black, longer in some areas than others. It wasn't matted or scraggly like you might expect from a wild animal. There was something deliberate about its appearance. The creature stood at the edge of the forest, with its back to me. It didn't turn around or acknowledge me in any way. It just stood there, perfectly still, like it was listening or smelling something in the woods. I remember thinking how odd that was. Here I am in a noisy truck, and this thing doesn't even seem curious. I wanted to stop completely. God, I wanted to get out and get a better look. But the corner was dangerous, with no shoulder to pull onto, and something in my gut told me that stopping might not be the smartest move. So I kept driving, slower than before, my eyes fixed on my rearview mirror, until the curve of the road took the figure out of sight. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands were shaking on the wheel, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I'm not ashamed to admit I was scared. Not necessarily of the creature itself, it hadn't made any threatening moves, but of what its existence meant. If that thing was real, what else might be out there that we don't know about? I drove the rest of the way to the job site on autopilot. My co-workers said I looked like I'd seen a ghost when I arrived. I didn't tell them anything. Who would believe me? I worked through the morning in a daze, going through the motions while my mind kept replaying those few seconds over and over. Around 11, when I finally got cell service, parts of the island are complete dead zones, I called my buddy Mike. We've been friends since high school, and he's the one person I knew wouldn't laugh me off the phone. I remember standing behind the work trailer, looking over my shoulder to make sure no one could hear me. "Mike, you're not going to believe what I just saw," I said, my voice lower than usual. "What's up, man? You sound weird." I told him everything. The figure on the road, the impossible leap, the size of it standing by the tree line. I described the hair color, the width of its shoulders, the way it moved. As I was talking, I realized how crazy it all sounded, but Mike didn't interrupt me once. When I finished, there was silence on the line for a few seconds. "You're serious, aren't you?" he finally said. "Dead serious. Mike, this wasn't a bear. It wasn't an elk or a moose or any animal I've ever seen, and I've been hunting these woods my whole life." "Sounds like you saw a Sasquatch, man." I hadn't wanted to say the word out loud, but yeah, that's exactly what it sounded like. A Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it. "I know how it sounds," I said. "If someone told me this story, I'd think they were full of shit or had been drinking. But I was stone cold sober, wide awake, and I saw what I saw." Mike didn't doubt me, which I appreciated. He asked a few questions, exactly where on Highway 4 this happened, what time it was, if anyone else was around who might have seen it too. I answered as best I could, but the truth was, I was alone out there. No witnesses to back up my story. The rest of the day was a blur. I couldn't focus on work. My boss asked if I was feeling sick, and I almost wished I was. At least that would explain why I kept zoning out and making stupid mistakes. I kept thinking about driving back along that same stretch of road at the end of the day. Would it still be there? Did I want it to be? On the drive back, I slowed down at that exact spot, scanning the trees and the creek bed. Nothing. Just the endless green of the forest and the patter of rain on my windshield. Part of me was relieved, but another part felt strangely disappointed. Like maybe if I saw it again, I could prove to myself that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. When I got home that night, I couldn't sleep. I sat up late, searching online for other sightings in the area. Turns out Vancouver Island has a long history of Sasquatch reports, dozens of them over the years, many along Highway 4 and in the surrounding wilderness. Some of the descriptions matched almost exactly what I'd seen. I found a website where people shared their encounters and almost posted my story there, but something held me back. The fear of ridicule, maybe, or the knowledge that once I put it out there, it would become part of my identity, whether I wanted it to or not. That guy who claims he saw Bigfoot, I wasn't ready for that. The next few weeks were strange. I kept taking that same route to work, always slowing down at that corner, always scanning the tree line. I started carrying a decent camera in my truck just in case. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings in a way I never had been before. I also found myself looking at the forest differently. Those woods had always been just scenery to me, beautiful but familiar. Now they felt mysterious, like they were hiding secrets. I'd catch myself staring into the trees as I drove, wondering what else might be in there, watching from the shadows. It's been 7 years, and I've never seen anything like it again. I've told a few close friends and family members, and the reactions have been mixed. Some believe me outright. Some humor me, but clearly think I was tired or my eyes were playing tricks. A couple have flat out called me crazy. The thing is, I don't care if people believe me or not anymore. I know what I saw. It was real. It was there. And it was not any known animal. The creature's movement, that incredible leap that seemed to defy physics, that's what sticks with me the most. No human could move like that. No bear or cougar either. Sometimes I wonder if it saw me too. If it was aware of my truck coming around the corner and chose to show itself, or if I just happened to be in the right place at the wrong time, or the wrong place at the right time, depending on how you look at it. I still drive that stretch of Highway 4 regularly. The bridge is still there, the creek still flows beneath it, and the forest still presses in close to the road. To anyone else, it's just another scenic corner on the way to Tofino. But to me, it's the place where my understanding of the world changed in an instant. I don't expect to see the creature again. Lightning rarely strikes twice, as they say. But I keep my eyes open when I'm in those woods now. And sometimes, when I'm driving that highway in the early morning mist, I catch myself slowing down at that corner. Not just for safety, but with a small, secret hope that maybe, just maybe, I'll get a second chance to glimpse something that shouldn't exist. Story 14. I've never shared this with anyone outside my immediate family, but it's been nearly 18 years, and I still can't explain what happened to me that summer night in Wisconsin. I'm not someone who believes in the supernatural or monsters in the woods. I'm a practical guy. I work in IT, I like facts and evidence. But what I encountered near the Apostle Islands defies any rational explanation I've been able to come up with. It was July of 2006. I'd been going through a rough patch after my divorce and needed some time alone to clear my head. I'd always heard the Apostle Islands area was beautiful, so I took a week off work and rented a small cabin near Bayfield, Wisconsin. The first few days were exactly what I needed. Hiking during the day, reading on the porch in the evenings, just decompressing. On my third night there, I decided to take a drive out to the Raspberry Island area after dinner. I'd eaten at this little seafood place by the harbor, had this amazing walleye that I still think about sometimes, and wasn't ready to head back to the cabin yet. It was one of those perfect summer evenings, you know. Full moon, clear skies, warm but not humid. The kind of night that makes you want to stay outside. I parked my car near this trailhead around 9:30 or so. The sun had just set, but there was still plenty of light from the moon. I grabbed my flashlight but didn't even need it at first. The trail led through this small clearing and then east toward Lake Superior. I just wanted to walk along the shoreline for a bit, listen to the waves, and enjoy the solitude. The lake was unusually calm that night, almost glass-like. I remember thinking it was weird how quiet everything was. No wind in the trees, barely any waves lapping at the shore, just this perfect stillness. I walked along the water's edge for maybe 45 minutes, skipping rocks occasionally and just enjoying being alone with my thoughts. Around 10:30, I decided to head back to my car. The moon was high now, casting this silvery light over everything. I took the same path back through the clearing, and that's when I first noticed something was off. There was this sound coming from the trees to my left, branches cracking but in this weird rhythm, crack, crack, crack in quick succession, then silence, then more cracking. At first, I thought maybe it was a deer or something, but the pattern was too regular, too deliberate, and whatever was making that sound was keeping pace with me as I walked, not getting closer, not falling behind, just matching my speed exactly. I picked up my pace a little, and the sounds quickened too. That's when I realized whatever was moving through those woods had to be big, really big. It sounded like entire branches or small trees were being pushed aside, not snapping exactly, but bending and then springing back into place. And the footfalls were heavy, not like a deer or even a bear. The ground seemed to vibrate slightly with each step. I'm not easily scared, but I started feeling this crawling sensation up my spine, that primal feeling of being watched that bypasses all rational thought. The air was still warm, but I had goosebumps all over my arms. I didn't run. Something told me that would be a mistake, but I walked as quickly as I could without making it obvious I was freaking out. The whole time, whatever it was stayed just out of sight. I kept glancing to my left, trying to catch a glimpse of it, but the tree line was about 20 yards away, and with the shadows, I couldn't see anything definitive. Just movement sometimes, like something large shifting between the trees. When I finally reached my car, I felt this momentary relief. I got in, locked the doors, and sat there for a second, catching my breath. My hands were shaking as I put the key in the ignition. I remember thinking how ridiculous I was being. It was probably just a moose or something, but deep down, I knew moose don't move like that. They don't stalk people. I turned the car around and started driving back down this narrow gravel road that led to the main highway. I'd only gone about 75 yards when my headlights caught something standing at the edge of the tree line. I still get chills thinking about it. This figure was standing perfectly still, just watching me. It was enormous. I'm talking at least 7.5, maybe 8 feet tall. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, and its arms hung down almost to its knees. The way it stood was almost human-like, but not quite. There was something off about its posture, something unnatural. But it was the face that still haunts me. I only saw it for a few seconds as I drove past, but it was disturbingly human-like. Not human, but human-like. It had this broad, flat nose and what looked like close-cropped hair or fur. But the strangest thing was that its head seemed to sit directly on its shoulders. There was almost no neck at all. And the eyes, God, the eyes. They reflected my headlights, glowing in that way animal eyes do at night, but they weren't animal eyes. They locked with mine as I drove past, and I felt this recognition. Like it knew me, or at least knew what I was. There was intelligence there, awareness, not just animal curiosity. For a split second I thought about stopping, even turning around to get a better look. Some insane part of my brain wanted to understand what I was seeing, but every survival instinct I had was screaming at me to get the hell out of there. I hit the gas and didn't slow down until I reached the main road and saw the lights of Bayfield in the distance. I spent the rest of the night in my cabin with all the doors locked, convinced I'd hear those heavy footsteps on my porch at any moment. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I told myself I'd imagined it, or at least exaggerated what I'd seen in the darkness. But I cut my trip short anyway, leaving that afternoon instead of staying the full week. For years, I didn't talk about it. I mean, what would I say? I saw some kind of giant forest creature that walked like a man. People would think I was crazy. I tried to forget about it, but I couldn't. The memory of those eyes looking at me, it stuck with me. In the summer of 2018, I finally worked up the courage to go back. My buddy Mike had heard bits and pieces of my story over the years, and he was curious. He's an outdoorsy guy, hunts, fishes, knows the woods, and he thought maybe we could figure out what I'd seen. We went back to the same area, found the same trailhead. It looked smaller in the daylight, less ominous. We hiked down the same path I'd taken that night, and everything seemed normal at first. But as we got deeper into the woods, we started noticing strange things about the trees. Some of them were bent or snapped in ways that didn't make sense. Not cut or sawed, but literally bent, including some that were a foot thick or more. One tree in particular stands out in my memory. It was bent in half at about waist height, almost at a 90-degree angle. The splintering looked fresh, maybe just a few days old. Mike said he'd never seen anything like it. No storm could do that, and it would take incredible strength to bend a tree that size. We also noticed how dense the forest was off the trail. When I was being followed that night, whatever it was had to have been moving through that thick undergrowth at the same speed I was walking on the clear path. Mike and I tried to push through the same area, and it was nearly impossible without making a huge amount of noise and getting scratched up by branches. We didn't find any footprints or definitive evidence, but standing there in those woods again, looking at those bent trees, I knew what I'd seen was real. Something had been there, something strong enough to push through dense forest without effort, strong enough to bend trees that a human couldn't possibly move. We stayed until early evening but left well before dark. Neither of us was willing to be in those woods after sunset. As we were driving away, Mike asked me what I thought it was. I didn't have an answer then, and I still don't now. I've researched everything I can think of. Bears standing on hind legs, moose, even the extremely remote possibility of some undiscovered primate. Nothing matches what I saw. Bears don't move the way that thing moved. Moose don't have those proportions or that face. And the idea of some unknown species of giant ape living in Wisconsin is just, well, it seems impossible. Yet I know what I saw. Those eyes looking back at me, that impossible height, those long arms. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there, still walking those woods at night. If other people have seen it but, like me, were too afraid of ridicule to come forward. All I know is that I won't be going back to those woods again, especially not alone, and never at night. Some things are better left alone, better left unexplained. But I still find myself looking a little more carefully at the tree line when I'm driving on dark roads, half expecting to see those reflective eyes looking back at me. Story 15. I've been sitting on this experience for nearly 18 years, and I still don't know what to make of it. I'm not the type who believes in monsters or cryptids or whatever you want to call them. I spent 11 years as a Marine Scout sniper, did 3 tours overseas, and I've always prided myself on staying level-headed in stressful situations. But what happened to me in the Eastern Cascades back in 2006 has never made sense, and I still get chills thinking about it. I was 34 at the time, been out of the Corps for about 2 years. That October, I decided to take a solo deer hunting trip into the wilderness of Central Oregon. I'd hunted there before. Beautiful country, remote as hell, and good populations of mule deer. I packed my gear into my old Jeep Cherokee, just the essentials. My Remington 708, a small 2-person tent, sleeping bag, water purifier, some freeze-dried meals, and enough supplies to last about a week. The area I was heading to was about 30 miles east of Sisters, Oregon, deep in National Forest land. I drove as far as the Forest Service roads would take me, then hiked in another 4 miles to set up my base camp at around 4,000 feet elevation. No cell service, no other people, just the way I liked it. The spot I chose was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by ponderosa pines with a little creek about 50 yards away for water. The first couple days were uneventful. I spent my time scouting, looking for game trails, checking for rubs, scrapes and droppings, all the usual hunter stuff. By the second day, I had located a promising area where deer were moving between their bedding areas in the thick timber and the open meadows where they fed in the mornings and evenings. I spotted a decent buck, probably a 4x4, moving with a small group of does. Nothing record-breaking, but definitely worth pursuing. On the third morning, I woke up at 4:30, made some instant coffee on my little camp stove, and headed out in the pitch black to get into position before first light. I hiked about a mile from my camp to a spot I'd picked out the day before, a slight rise that overlooked a series of small meadows. I settled in against the base of a large pine tree, set up my small tripod for my rifle, and waited. The temperature was probably in the low 30s, and I remember my breath making little clouds in the beam of my headlamp when I first got there. As the sky began to lighten from black to deep blue, I clicked off my headlamp and let my eyes adjust. This is always my favorite part of hunting, that quiet transition from night to day when the world starts to wake up. You can hear the forest come alive gradually if you're paying attention. It was around 6:15 when I first heard movement. The sun wasn't fully up yet, but there was enough light to see across the meadow, maybe 100 yards distance from edge to edge. The sound came from the west, something moving through the underbrush, snapping twigs, rustling leaves. Not particularly quiet, which was good for me. I figured it was probably a deer, maybe even my buck from the day before. I slowly raised my rifle, settling the stock against my shoulder, and peered through the scope, my finger resting lightly outside the trigger guard. The movement continued, getting closer to the edge of the meadow. I steadied my breathing, the way I'd done countless times before, both as a hunter and in the military. Then something stepped partially out from the tree line. At first glance, in that early morning light, I thought it was another hunter. The silhouette was upright, and my initial reaction was annoyance. This was public land, sure, but I hadn't seen anyone else for miles, and this person had just wandered right into my hunting area. I lowered my rifle and whistled, not loud, but enough to let them know I was there. I didn't want to spook all the game in the area by yelling, but I also didn't want this other hunter to walk right into my line of fire if they were tracking something. What happened next is where everything went sideways. The figure turned directly toward me, faster than a person normally would, and that's when I caught my first real glimpse. Even in the dim light, I could tell immediately that something was wrong with the proportions. The shoulders were impossibly wide. The head seemed to sit directly on those shoulders, with almost no visible neck, and it was tall, really tall. Before I could process what I was seeing, the figure ducked back into the brush at the edge of the meadow. The movement was fluid and quick, nothing like how a person in hunting gear would move. My first thought, honestly, was that some asshole was out there in a ghillie suit or something, trying to mess with other hunters. I set my rifle down against the tree. I don't know why I did that. In retrospect, it was stupid, and stood up. I walked a few steps into the meadow, intending to confront whoever it was. "Hey!" I called out, not shouting, but projecting my voice across the meadow. "I'm hunting here, man!" That's when it stood up again, fully visible now at the edge of the clearing. And there was no mistaking that this wasn't a person, not even close. The thing was enormous, 7, maybe 8 feet tall, with shoulders that had to be at least 4 feet across. Its proportions were all wrong, arms too long, torso too wide, legs slightly bowed, and it was covered in dark hair, not like fur exactly, more like a really hairy person, but all over. I froze, completely froze. 11 years in the Marines, including combat situations, and I had never felt that specific kind of fear before. It was primal, instinctive. My mouth went completely dry, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. Then it started making noise, a series of low grunts that gradually increased in volume. It began shaking the bushes in front of it, grabbing branches and violently rattling them. The display was clearly meant to intimidate, and it was working. I'd seen bears do similar things when threatened, but this was different. There was an intelligence behind it that was unmistakable. I slowly backed up toward my rifle, never taking my eyes off the creature. When I reached the tree, I fumbled behind me until my hand closed around the stock. I brought the rifle up and peered through the scope. The magnification gave me a clearer view of its face, and that's what really shook me. It wasn't fully covered in hair. The face had exposed skin, dark in color, with a broad, flat nose and large lips. The forehead was prominent, sloping back into what looked like a sagittal crest. The eyes were deep-set under heavy brow ridges, and they were looking directly at me with unmistakable awareness. I had the crosshairs centered on its chest. My finger moved to the trigger. In that moment, I had a clear shot, and something that size would have gone down even with my deer rifle. But I couldn't do it. Something deep in my gut told me not to pull that trigger. This wasn't an animal, not in the way a deer or bear is an animal. There was something else there, something I couldn't explain. We stayed like that, me with my rifle aimed, it standing at the edge of the meadow, for what felt like forever but was probably only 20 or 30 seconds. Then, keeping the rifle pointed in its direction, I slowly raised my left hand, palm out, in what I hoped would be recognized as a non-threatening gesture. I don't know why I did that. It wasn't a conscious decision. The creature stopped its display immediately. It went completely still, watching me. Then it slowly backed up into the tree line and disappeared. I didn't move for at least 5 minutes. I kept my rifle up, scanning the edge of the meadow, half expecting it to charge out. At me, nothing happened. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. When I finally got the courage to move, I gathered my stuff as quickly and quietly as possible and backed away, keeping my eyes on that spot where it had been standing. I didn't turn and actually run until I was a good distance away, and then I booked it back to my camp. I've never packed up a campsite so fast in my life. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely roll up my sleeping bag. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way I hadn't felt since my first firefight overseas. Within 30 minutes, I had everything strapped to my pack and was hiking out, moving as fast as I could with 60 pounds of gear on my back. I didn't stop until I reached my Jeep, and even then, I didn't feel safe. I drove north for about 35 miles before finally pulling over at another campground. I sat there in my vehicle for a long time, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Was it a bear? No way. I've encountered black bears and even a grizzly once in Montana. This was nothing like that. Was it someone in a costume? Out there, miles from any road before dawn? And no costume could account for the fluid way it moved, the proportions, the expressions I saw on its face. I ended up staying for the rest of my planned trip, but I hunted in completely different areas. I never went back to that spot. I kept telling myself I'd imagined it or exaggerated it somehow, but I know what I saw. I've replayed it in my mind 1,000 times since then. I've never told this story to many people. My ex-wife knew. She's the one who suggested it might have been a Sasquatch or Bigfoot, but I always hated those terms. They make it sound like some cartoon character. Whatever I saw wasn't a myth or a legend. It was flesh and blood and intelligent. The few friends I've told either think I'm bullshitting them or that I mistook a bear for something else. One buddy, another, former Marine, suggested maybe I was having some kind of PTSD episode, which pissed me off, but I get why he'd think that. The thing that still haunts me isn't the fear I felt. It's the moment when I had it in my sights and couldn't pull the trigger. It wasn't conscious. Something deeper than thought stopped me, like some part of me recognized that creature as something, I don't know, something more than just an animal, something that shouldn't be killed. I've been back to the eastern Cascades many times since then. I still hunt there almost every year, but I'm different now. I'm more alert, more aware of my surroundings. And sometimes, when I'm sitting alone in the pre-dawn darkness, waiting for first light, I catch myself scanning the tree line not for deer, but for something much larger moving upright through the forest. I don't know what I encountered that morning. I don't have a name for it, but I know it was real, and I know it's still out there somewhere. Story 16. I still get goosebumps when I think about what happened that day in Giles County. It's been 26 years, but I remember it like it was yesterday. The year was 1997, and my girlfriend Sarah and I were doing a section hike on the Appalachian Trail. We'd been planning this trip for months. Both of us worked office jobs in Richmond and desperately needed to escape the fluorescent lights and computer screens. We'd been on the trail for about a week, making decent progress each day. The weather had been cooperating, mostly sunny with temperatures in the 60s, perfect for hiking. That morning, we woke up feeling adventurous. We'd passed a smaller trail the day before that wasn't on our original itinerary, but I'd heard from other hikers that it offered some incredible views of the valley below. "Let's check out that side trail today," I suggested to Sarah as we packed up our campsite. Mountain View Trail, I think someone called it. Sarah was always up for exploring, so around 10 in the morning, we veered off the main Appalachian Trail and onto this narrower path. It wasn't maintained as well, more overgrown with fewer trail markers. But that was part of the appeal. We felt like we were discovering something special that most hikers missed. For the first couple hours, everything was completely normal. We crossed a small stream, saw some interesting rock formations, and stopped for lunch on a fallen log. The only people we'd seen all day were an older couple who'd passed us early on, but turned back about a mile in. After that, we had the trail to ourselves. It was around 3 in the afternoon when things started feeling different. I can't really explain it, but there was this subtle shift in the atmosphere. The birds seemed quieter. The air felt heavier somehow. "Does it feel weird to you?" Sarah asked, stopping to take a sip from her water bottle. I nodded, relieved I wasn't the only one noticing it. "Yeah, kind of. Like the forest is holding its breath or something." We laughed it off, blaming it on tired legs and too much trail mix, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Still, the weather was perfect. Clear blue skies, about 60 degrees, and we decided to push on a bit further before turning back. About 30 minutes later, we spotted 3 deer bounding across the trail about 50 yards ahead of us. They were moving fast, clearly spooked by something. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Maybe another hiker ahead, or a fox. Now, I wish I'd paid more attention to which direction they were running from. We continued hiking for another 5 or 10 minutes when we heard it for the first time. This bizarre vocalization echoing through the trees. I've struggled for years to describe this sound accurately. The closest thing I can compare it to is the character Chewbacca from Star Wars, but that doesn't really do it justice. It was like someone trying to talk underwater, garbled speech patterns with deep guttural tones that rose and fell in pitch. It wasn't an animal sound I recognized, and I've spent enough time outdoors to know what bears, coyotes, and other wildlife sound like. Sarah grabbed my arm. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," I said, straining to hear it again. "Maybe someone messing around." The sound came again, louder this time, echoing strangely through the trees. It seemed to be coming from about 100 yards ahead of us, just around a bend in the trail. Looking back, what we did next was incredibly stupid. Instead of turning around, we actually called out to whatever was making the noise. "Hello?" I shouted. "Anyone there?" Sarah joined in. "Hey, we can hear you." Silence followed. Complete, unnatural silence. Even the usual forest background noise seemed to disappear. We stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds, straining to hear anything. "Should we keep going?" Sarah whispered. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to turn back, but curiosity won out. "Let's just go a little further. If we hear it again and it sounds weird, we'll turn around." We continued walking more slowly now, constantly scanning the trees around us. The trail narrowed as it curved around the mountainside, with a steep slope to our right and dense forest to our left. The sun was getting lower, casting long shadows through the trees. I checked my watch. It was just after 5 in the evening. We'd need to start heading back soon anyway to set up camp before dark. That's when we heard it again, that same garbled, speech-like sound, but closer now, maybe only 50 feet ahead. It sounded like multiple vocalizations strung together, almost like sentences. There was a rhythm to it that felt deliberate, not random like animal noises usually are. We froze in our tracks. This time, we didn't call out. "Michael," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking slightly. "I really think we should go back." I nodded, but before we could turn around, we heard a tremendous crashing sound coming through the underbrush. Something large was moving through the forest, and it was moving fast, breaking branches and rustling leaves as it went. Whatever it was heading straight toward the trail in front of us. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. Sarah's fingernails dug into my arm as we stood there, completely paralyzed with fear. The sun was getting lower, casting everything in this eerie golden orange light. And then we saw it. About 30 feet ahead of us, a dark figure burst out of the trees onto the trail. It was humanoid, walking on 2 legs, but definitely not human. Even in the fading light, I could tell it was massive, broader and heavier than any person I've ever seen. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, with long arms that hung down past its knees. The entire body was covered in what looked like dark hair or fur. The thing paused for just a second when it reached the trail, and I swear it turned its head slightly in our direction. I couldn't make out any facial features in the shadows, just this dark silhouette against the dimming forest. That single moment felt like it stretched into eternity. Then it was moving again, crashing down the mountainside with shocking speed and agility for something so large. It disappeared into the forest below, the sounds of its passage fading as it went. Sarah and I remained frozen in place, neither of us breathing. When I finally found my voice, it came out as a croak. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Sarah nodded, her face pale. What was it?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "I have no idea." We debated what to do next. The sun was setting rapidly now, and the thought of being on this unfamiliar trail in the dark was terrifying. But going forward meant potentially running into whatever that was. In the end, we decided to turn back the way we came, moving as quickly and quietly as possible. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made us jump. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced we were being followed. The forest that had seemed so peaceful that morning now felt oppressive and threatening. Shadows seemed to move between the trees, and more than once I thought I heard that strange, garbled vocalization in the distance behind us. We practically ran the last mile back to the main Appalachian trail, not stopping until we reached a small clearing where a few other hikers had set up camp. We never told them what we'd seen. How do you even start that conversation without sounding completely insane? Instead, we made up some excuse about losing track of time and asked if we could set up our tent near theirs. Safety in numbers. Neither of us slept that night. We lay in our tent, listening to every sound outside, jumping at every crack and rustle. Sarah kept asking me what I thought we'd seen, but I had no answers. "A bear walking on its hind legs?" she suggested at one point, desperation in her voice. "Bears don't run like that," I said, "and they don't make sounds like that." "Then what? Bigfoot?" She gave a nervous laugh that quickly died. I didn't answer. The word felt ridiculous, something from tabloid headlines and late-night radio shows. But what else could explain what we'd seen? A person in a costume deep in the Virginia mountains, miles from any road or town. It made no sense. We cut our trip short the next day, hiking out to the nearest road and hitchhiking back to where we'd left our car. We never reported what we saw. Who would believe us? Forest rangers would think we were pranking them or had seen a bear in poor lighting. Our friends back home would have laughed it off as a campfire story. But I know what I saw. That figure moving through the forest wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal I've ever encountered. The way it moved, so fast and sure-footed on that steep terrain, and those strange vocalizations that sounded almost like language. I still get chills thinking about it. Sarah and I broke up about 6 months later. She never wanted to go hiking again after that, and honestly, neither did I for a long time. It's only in the last few years that I've started going back into the woods, but never alone and never at dusk. And I've never returned to Giles County. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has seen it, if there are other hikers out there with similar stories who, like us, were too afraid of ridicule to come forward. All I know is that something is out there in those mountains, something that doesn't want to be found.